Hello and welcome to a very special episode, ladies and gentlemen. Just like my fairly recent video on the first focal plane LPVO comparison, this is going to be a comparison with scopes ranging from the 1.5 to 2.5 minimum magnification up to, well, in this case, 20x. To get this out of the way first and foremost, I'm going to be capping this at 2.5x on the minimum, because if I go any higher than that to, let's say, a 3x, which would mean 3 to 18s, 3 to 15s, sometimes even 3 to 20s, would be mentioned in this video. And that would just make this way too long. I'm already guessing that this is going to be about a 2-hour long video, so I want to try to have it be focused specifically on this magnification series of scopes. And because of that, I'm going to be dubbing these Intermediate Powered Variable Optics. Basically, the minimum magnification is just over 1x, and it's capped to just about 2.5x. That would make everything in the 3 to 4.5x range on the bottom end would be an MPVO. And of course, an LPVO would be a 1x minimum max, if that makes sense. That's why I'm calling these intermediate, because they are in between an LPVO and an MPVO. Now, yes, a lot of people would say that these are MPVOs, but so technically is a 4 to 20 in my opinion. I exclude HPVOs for being around the 4.5 to 5x minimum magnification, and up to as, well, as big as they go. That is why I am just giving these their own separate name, so when I say IPVO, hopefully more people can understand what I'm referring to. As a result of that, there are a lot of scopes that I truly love for the SPR world that aren't going to be mentioned in this video. Again, however, that is all by design, primarily because I feel that this magnification range series of scopes is very, very, very capable, and I think a lot of people, myself included, are very curious to see how they stack up against one another. Another few criteria that I had for all these scopes is they have to be in the first focal plane, they have to offer illumination, and they have to have some sort of capable tactical turrets. For the Windage, I don't care if it's capped, but it has to at least be locking or capped. An elevation, I'd like to see at least a 0 stop, but locking and 0 stop would be preferred. And as far as a side parallax goes, well, it all depends on the architecture of the scope we're talking about. The only one out of the bunch is the Leupold Mk4HD 2.5 to 10 that doesn't have it. But we will be talking about the Credo 2 to 10 by 36, because there's a lot of scopes that I have talked about on this channel already in this magnification range. In fact, this is my little cheat sheet of all the scopes that are either on this table or other scopes that I've reviewed in past years. But I'm not going to have up-to-date footage on a lot of these. Instead, what I'm going to do is focus on the 7 scopes that I've had for the last few months and then roll in B footage of everything else. As far as all the other scopes that are available on the market, to which there are a lot that fit this criteria of IPVO, we're going to talk about them, but not in great depth because I don't really have a whole lot of information other than what we could find on the internet. So with that all being said, what is on the table before us? Starting out on your left, we have the Athlon Helos BTR Gen 2 2 to 12. This scope should need no introduction. It was last year's scope of the year for very good reasons. And it's also one of the cheapest options that we have. All the prices I'm going to be talking about are going to be the normal MSRP that you find them for regularly. A lot of these can be found on sale for much less, but I'm giving you the regular street price for as these are found readily available. And the price on the Athlon is right around $500. I have seen them go as low as the low 400s brand new to sometimes even the high 300s, which is an insanely good deal. But even at the $500 that this thing costs brand new, I think it's absolutely worth it. But you'll be able to see that for yourself, hopefully in this video. Next to that, we have the Primary Arms GLx 2.5 to 10. This is a scope that a lot of people on the internet have talked about for many, many years. It was very unfortunate when Primary Arms discontinued this series of GLx line, and a lot of people have been hoping that Primary Arms would bring back something like this. And after having my hands on this for a few months, I can absolutely understand why. These typically go for around the $500-ish price point, condition and reticle dependent. So if you have one that's beat up, you might be able to find it for a little bit less. But I have seen them go for a pretty penny, and rightfully so. They're, as you'll see, a pretty nice optic. Now, there are some rumblings that Primary Arms is planning on bringing this scope back, but I have no information on that other than just that Hopefully, true comment. Next to that, we have the SwampFox Kentucky Long 2-12. This is also in the $500 price point, but I feel that this is superseded by the Athlon Helos BTR Gen 2 as just being a better overall package, especially for the price. It is on the table because I do have it on my shelf at all times, and I have reviewed it in the past, but I'm not going to be including it in this mega comparison as in-depth as the rest of these scopes because I feel there are other options that are a little bit better than it. So, goodbye Kentucky Long. And replacing it is its big brother, the WarHawk. This 2-10 is tremendously nicely optioned. For $560, there's a lot that this scope offers that I think a lot of people are going to be very interested in, primarily with the glass. It really does punch above its weight. Next to that, however, is the brand new Vector Continental 2-12. These are made in China, but they use Chinese-made shot glass. And I just got confirmation last night that these are going to be around the $600 to $700 price point, which is pretty impressive considering the build quality on these, the fit, the finish, the feel, and the overall performance. But again, that's something you'll be seeing soon. Next to that is the Leupold Mk4HD 2.5 to 10 by 42. Features the illuminated TMR reticle. I've been boasting about the scope for several months on my channel, and I'm sorry that the review took as long as it did, but I put it on my gun to actually use it for Woodland Brutality. It performed flawlessly, and I've enjoyed using it so much that I haven't had the time to actually review it, but now is the time to see how it compares against the rest of the field. In illuminated form, these come in at $1,200, but if you don't want or need illumination, you can get these for right around $1,000. Next up is the Steiner H6Xi. This is a 2-12 by 42. This is probably the scope that a lot of people are most interested in, believe it or not. And I can understand why. I'm a big fan of Steiner scopes, even though when I buy a Steiner, I usually don't have it for that long and I sell it off. But they are very capable of making a very good optic. We will see how this $1,300-ish scope fares. And last but not least on the tabletop is the March FX 1.5 to 15 by 42. This is in the dual focal plane. So there's a reticle on the first and a reticle on the second focal plane. If you watched my LPVO comparison, you'll see exactly what I mean and how this performs with the March Shorty 1 to 10. I did feel that the March Shorty 1 to 10 and the March, I can't remember the acronym for the name, but the 3 to 24, I felt that they were overworked in their respective fields. I'm hoping that this 1.5 to 15 being in a larger body with a larger front objective with the same multiplier as the Shorty will perform better than the Shorty, but there's only one way to find out. There are a lot of other scopes on this list that I haven't mentioned, but I'm going to put up a giant screen picture and with a bunch of numbers, and we're going to talk about it, and we're going to roll them in as the video progresses. So with all that being said, go wash your face, go to the bathroom, get yourself a snack and a drink, and prepare yourself for this probably 2-hour-long, very in-depth video.
Ah, hello, Gordon Freeman. It's good to see you.
To make life a little bit less complicated, I decided to make a list. Formulate a list with as many scopes that fit this criteria of IPVO that I have specified as possible. As you could very clearly see, there are 35 different optics that I have been able to find that fit what I am trying to achieve here. Now, I say that because I'm sure that there's a couple of different scopes out there that I missed, and to be brutally honest, some websites are really hard to navigate and some things are really hard to search for. I then compiled this list of all the data that I felt was going to be relevant to the video. On the very top, you're going to see all of the information of what it is in red, and then all the scopes below that are going to be, well, just that. As far as the two different colored text, black are scopes that I have not reviewed, and green are scopes that I have reviewed. In my LPVO comparison video, I took all of the other scopes that I didn't review and I filled them in the gaps with all of the different segments throughout that video. So for example, the reticles, I talked about all the reticles. Illumination, I talked about all the illumination, and everything else based on what I was able to find online to give us a rough idea of where they would be placed. What I'm going to do with this video to streamline it as much as possible is talk about all the other scopes that I have not gotten my hands on right now, and then focus on the other scopes that I have reviewed, and then the other scopes that I've had for the last several months, putting them head to head against one another. For anyone that wants this list, I might make this public, and if I do, I will post it in the comment section below and in the description of the video. So if you're curious about having this for your own records, I'm going to try to figure that out and post it accordingly. Starting with the top down, we have the Steiner H6Xi 2.5 to 15 by 50. This is the smaller version of the 3-18 that I recently reviewed, but it only comes with the SCR reticle, which is fine, but it also gets really fine below 5x. The T5Xi 3-15 that I reviewed had the SCR reticle, and I felt that below 5x on that, it was already really hard to pick up. So with this one here, I'd imagine it's even worse. Next down from that is the US Optics TS20X, which is a 2.5 to 20 scope. I should also mention on my list that if I leave an area blank, it's because I couldn't find enough information to put a positive answer there. So in this case, I don't know where these are made. I believe they're China, but I don't want to go out there on a limb and say it absolutely is. One thing that USO does well, though, is their reticle options, to which there are 3. And I think all 3 of them, barring any sort of abnormalities as far as not having posts that fully extend, would probably be pretty decent in this magnification range. Think of it kind of like an NX8 and what that scope offers. Next up, we're actually going to skip the US Optics FDN 1.8 to 10 because the MR10 that I reviewed was very similar to that. So we're going to look now at the Schmidt & Bender Polar 2.5 to 10. This is the first one of those in-between optics where it's set up more or less for hunting, but it could still fit this role, I feel, fairly well. It's got illumination, a simple reticle, but it does have an exposed elevation turret, so you can dial for elevation if you so choose. The Vortex Viper PST Gen 2 2 to 10 was always a scope I really wanted, but never felt like it was perfectly set up for this magnification range. The reticle seems okay, but they're really heavy and no locking windage or elevation turret sort of sucks. The Leupold VX5 and VX6 HDs are 2 to 10s and 2 to 12s. We're going to be focusing primarily on the 2 to 10 because I think optically that would be a better, easier scope to get behind and actually use. These do feature very simple reticles, but the CDS turrets are fantastic and there is illumination. And they're also really lightweight. I really do feel that these 2 scopes are as simple as could possibly be, but still fit the criteria. Probably one of the most well-known scopes of this bunch is going to be the NightForce NX8 2.5 to 10. They originally came out with a 32mm front objective, but now they're more readily available with the 42mm front objective, and in the used market, the 32mm ones go for a very pretty penny. They are most commonly found with the MIL-R reticle, which is exceptional, but keep in mind it's in the second focal plane and there is no lock on the elevation turret. The Burris Veracity 2.5 to 12 has all the makings to be a potentially good optic, but unfortunately, I won't know because I haven't got my hands on one, but maybe that'll change. Tract is one of those companies that was started by a bunch of people that used to work for Nikon and make basically only high-end Japanese optics. I've reviewed a couple of their stuff so far, and I really love the physical controls of all of them, but optically, I just felt that they were a little bit restrictive, especially compared to some other options out in the field. However, on paper, this 2.5 to 15 looks to be very promising, albeit it's a little bit on the heavy side. Just like with Tract, the Maven RS 1.2 is sold directly by Maven, but unlike the Tract, you can get this in one of 3 different reticle options. However, I don't believe there's a lock on the elevation turret on this, whereas with the Tract there is. But if you like conspiracy theories, take a real close look at the specs between these 2 and ask yourself, are they really that different? If there's one scope on this list that I'd probably be the most excited to get behind, it would be the ZCO 210. This is a 2 to 10 that features basically everything you could ever ask for in an optic like this. Now, this hasn't come out yet, but it will be offered in one of 3 different reticle options, all of which seem to be fairly promising, if not a little bit odd, like the Predator reticle, but I do like that they give you the option. On the lower side of the budget spectrum is the SIG Tango MSR 2 to 12. This also, on paper, seems pretty good, but that reticle just does not fill me with confidence. For these next few Zeiss and Swarovski options, I'm going to just bring them all together and talk about them as a cluster, because all of these feature more or less the exact same style of setup. They're all going to be fairly lightweight. They're all going to be fairly simple. They're all going to be very expensive, but they're all going to feature some very nice magnification ranges, anywhere from 1.7 to 10, all the way up to 2.5 to 15. Now, these are definitely more on the border of if this actually classifies, but for most of what they offer, they technically do. However, I've never been behind any of these scopes before, but a lot of people have sworn by the overall glass clarity. And given the price point and where they're made and the name, I mean, if anyone's going to do crystals halfway decent, it should be Swarovski. The rest of the scopes on this list that are in green are scopes that I have previously reviewed in the past or are part of this mega comparison. So what we're going to take a look at in the next part are going to be those scopes, controls, and features. Starting from the cheapest and working our way to the most expensive, we are going to have the Athlon Helos BTR Gen 2 2-12 kick this thing off. I've had this exact scope that we are looking at right now for a while, and through my many months of beating it, I have to say it has held up extremely well. The only thing that I could say might have loosened up a little bit is the parallax knob, where it's got a little bit of wiggle to it, but it still functions flawlessly. Despite the low price, it does pack a lot of features, but it definitely needs a throw lever if you ever plan on using this thing with any sort of authority. The thumb ramp on it's fine, but the throw lever really does add that little bit of oomph when you need it. For the $500 price point that these come in at regularly, these are an absolute home run. The primary Arms GLx 2.5 to 10 is almost as lightweight as we can go in this entire video, but it still packs a lot of features, including a first focal plane reticle, a very nice magnification ring, wonderful turrets, and maybe a little bit too large of an illumination dial, but all in all, it is a very cohesive package. I think the weakest link of this thing is the reticle, but we'll be talking about that very soon. The Vortex Viper PST Gen 1 2.5 to 10 by 32 is probably the oldest overall architectured scope that we're going to be taking a look at here today. Despite that, it still has one of the shortest magnification ring throws I've ever seen, and it's really nice as a result. Unfortunately, the illumination knob being where it is in the back of the rear ocular housing is a little bit awkward for a lot of people. It takes up a lot of view. But the biggest thing with this are the turrets that are non-locking and non-zero stopped. They do come with shims to pack underneath it for your elevation turret, but with your windage, it was as it was, large and unlocked. It's definitely showing its age with its overall feature set, but as a result, that's why it's not going to be the best performer here. I bought this Burris XTR II 2 to 10 from SWFA last year when they were blowing out all their old inventory, and I got it for a song and a dance, and I thought it was going to be one of my favorite scopes. The only thing I really loved about it was the G2B reticle that I've seen and used in other Steiner products in the past, but unfortunately the controls on this felt fairly mushy and just a little bit off given the original price point of this thing being like around $1,000. I'm going to be rolling in both the SwampFox Kentucky Long 2 to 12 and the WarHawk 2 to 10 for most of these segments because they're fairly similar, with the exception of the WarHawk having vastly superior controls on the turrets, parallax, and illumination control. For the roughly mid-500s that these typically go for usually, they do offer a fair amount. However, they do feel like some of the cheapest materials have been used in this scope as opposed to everything else that we're going to be looking at. As a result of that, it could definitely make you feel like you're not getting a really good product, but sometimes we can't judge a book by its cover, or at least not entirely. For not that much more money, the Vector Continental 2 to 12 is still made in China, like the SwampFoxes, but feels vastly superior as far as build quality and overall feature set. It really does feel like a much more premium scope than what it is. For the regular street price of $5.99 before the C_does 10% savings coupon code that you guys should use if you're buying them, they're impressive for many, many reasons. Just like with the SwampFox, I'm going to roll in both Trijicon Credos, the 2 to 10 and this, the 2.5 to 15. Now, physically, they're both almost exactly the same with the exception of a couple of different sizes, again, because of the magnification range differences. But for around the $1,000 price point, these Japanese-made scopes really do feel exceptionally good in hand. All the controls are simple and straightforward. They might not have locking elevation turrets, which is a bit of a buzzkill. And the 2 to 10 might not have a side parallax, which is probably the only thing that scope really needed to be much more enjoyable than what it is. But both of these scopes at least make you feel that your $1,000 was money well spent. The Leupold Mk4HD is a scope that I've been teasing for way too long, but bear with me, it's going to be worth it. For just around $1,200 for this illuminated TMR version, there is very little to really go wrong with this scope. It's one of the few scopes that we're going to be looking at that does not have a side parallax. It also has everything else you'd probably ever look for in a scope like this if you're looking for something that's very simple, lightweight, and efficient. I really do feel that this hits a really nice stride, and it's definitely much more catered towards those that just want to get behind something and use it quite quickly. I was not expecting the Steiner H6Xi 2 to 12 to make as big of a wave as it did, but I have had more requests to review this scope than any other scopes in this entire lineup. Yes, from multiple different sources, everyone thinks that this is going to be the IPVO to get. Well, we're going to find out. Feature-wise, it's got a fast-focusing locking rear eyepiece, which I love. It's got still a very simple basic magnification ring, but it does come included with a throw lever with 2 different size cattails, which is very nice. The battery compartment, Steiner finally made some tweaks to it to improve upon it. And the side parallax knob is very small and goes down to 25 meters. Capped windage is exactly how I'd want this scope set up, but with the elevation turret, you have the choice of 0 stops exposed or just capped. Why not just take your locking mechanism from, I don't know, your T6 line of scope, Steiner, and throw it on there because it's fairly low profile and fairly lightweight, and it would solve your problem of needing multiple turrets. The NightForce NX8 2.5 to 20 is one of the largest magnification swings that we're going to be taking a look at that doesn't cost $3,000. Instead, it's only $2,000, which is a bit of a bargain if you ask me. The only thing that this scope really needs to make this ultimately wow is just a locking elevation turret, but at least it features a very good 0 stop, so for a lot of you that won't make a lick of difference. Controls wise though, this thing is absolutely sensational, featuring a locking eyepiece, a wonderful little cattail on the magnification ring, exceptionally good feeling turrets, and basically just everything about it feels amazing. So much so that it absolutely justifies the $2,000 price tag. A little bit of a harder pill to swallow is the Leupold Mk5HD 2 to 10 that comes in for the illuminated TMR version, $2,500, 20% more expensive than an NX8. However, this is a completely different setup style optic, whereas the NX8 is much more of the intermediate to medium powered, more precision focused end of the spectrum. The Mk5HD, just very similar to the Mk4HD, is definitely set up for the I need to get on target fast and just make good shots all day long. Controls and feature-wise, this is a little bit more packed than the Mk4HD, and it does feel a little bit better put together. And the biggest difference, though, is the 30mm main tube on the Mk4 to the 35 on the Mk5. It really does change the overall feel, fit, and finish of this optic quite dramatically, believe it or not. Even though this is video of the USO MR10, the FDN10 is still a 1.8 to 10 by 42mm front objective, American-made battle tank of an optic. This thing is so overbuilt as far as its overall construction and how it feels that you could probably bludgeon someone to death with this, probably better than a crowbar. Just saying. It does have a lot of interesting features, but this is a very interesting optic. The MR10 at least had a lot of tunneling going from minimum towards the middle range of the magnification. I do not know if the FDN10 is the exact same setup, but if it is, it's going to be a little bit disappointing. But as far as something that feels like it would withstand a bomb, this is so far the best option. The weirdest scope, as far as feature set goes, probably has to go to the IOR Valdata Breaker 2-16. Even just looking at this video just reminded me of how weird everything about this scope was. And for the $2,500 that these go for, it makes me question everything about it and why someone would really go towards this as opposed to anything else that we're looking at. Optically, this thing does perform extremely well, as you will see, but if you're not behind it 100% perfect, it's just a nightmare of an optic. Even just looking over this footage, I'm just getting nostalgia for all the wrong reasons. It's just a very weird scope. And by far and away, the most feature-packed scope is also, ironically, the most expensive. The March FX 1.5-15 is a dual focal plane IPVO. In fact, it's the only one that we're going to be looking at really in depth today. It also features a locking rear eyepiece, an amazingly smooth magnification ring, very, very nice locking turrets, and not one, but two ways of controlling your illumination. A push button to turn it on and off, and a little rheostat dial on your parallax knob to adjust the intensity. This thing feels like a $3,000 scope. It's like a jeweled watch with how everything functions and everything meshes together. It is simply staggering. And with that, let's move on to reticles and tracking.
The time is now
Tracking time.
Reticles are extremely personal. What works for me might not work for you, and so on and so forth throughout the entire planet. However, how I'm going to try to structure this are reticles that are the easiest and fastest to get behind, and then fading them towards the more precision end of things. Starting this off is going to be with the TMR, found in both the Mark IV and Mk5HDs. It is very thick, it is very coarse with illumination, it's also pretty bright. There is a non-illuminated version that's actually a little bit thinner. It goes against all common knowledge of why Leupold would do that, but Leupold does a lot of things that we do not quite understand. It is a little bit sparse on information, especially on the drops for elevation if you do plan on using this reticle for holding, which you can and probably will do. I have, but it's nowhere near as capable of a precision end of use as some of the other reticles we're about to look at. In the same vein as the TMR is the Milgap reticle found in the USO products. Just like the TMR, it's a very simple milling style reticle, but unlike the Leupold, USO was smart enough to put numbers next to the stadia lines where you'd actually have to hold for certain distances, and it makes using this reticle a little bit easier. The lines on it are a little bit thinner than what we see with the TMR, but the illumination on the Milgap reticle is not only the full reticle itself, but it also gets much brighter. There are a lot of things that I really like about this particular setup, mostly just how simple it is, but it's definitely still very fast. And in the 1.8 to 10x magnification range that this MR10/FDN10 coincides with, I think it's a pretty nice package. Next up is the G2B reticle found in the Burris XTR II. You will also find this reticle in a lot of Steiner products, and that's because Burris/Steiner are, well, almost one and the same here in the USA. The G2B is a very old style reticle, but just like the previous two that we looked at, it's a very simple milling reticle. The only thing is it gets a little bit finer on the overall thickness of the crosshairs in the middle, which is why it's a little bit farther along the list towards the precision end of things. At maximum magnification, you can see those stadia lines in the middle are quite fine, and the illumination is good, but nowhere near as good as the other two we just looked at. Overall, this is still pretty decent for holding, but it's definitely much more on the speed end of the spectrum. Coming in at the middle, the midway, where I feel speed and precision coincide on the same plane of existence. We are first going to look at the AMHR2 found in the Athlon Helos BTR Gen 2 2-12. This is one of my favorite reticles of the bunch, folks. That large center dot in the middle is 1 MOA. If you're putting this on a minute or a minute and a half gun, you put the dot simply where you want a bullet to appear, and it will appear there. At the lower magnifications, it is very easy to pick up and read, and the illumination on it's not half bad either. But when you go to full magnification, you can see that the Christmas tree underneath it still illustrates a very fine aiming point, so you could use this reticle very effectively, as you will see, for holding at distance. Overall, it is a wonderful combination of speed and precision. This one's a bit of an oddball. It is the Griffin reticle found in the GLx 2.5-10. I didn't know where else to put this because it sort of is in a class of its own. The center chevron is very large, and it's the only thing that gets illuminated, but the illumination is not as bright as it really needs to be to function, I think, the way that Primary Arms had it intended. However, when you increase the magnification to its maximum, the drops underneath that chevron are gorgeous. The horseshoe around the center part of the reticle does draw your eye to the center fairly quickly, but it still lacks a little bit more of the, wow, I know exactly what I'm looking at, as opposed to some of the other reticles that we looked at. But the Christmas tree underneath the chevron, like I already mentioned, is extremely fine and very easy to pick up and use. So that's why this is sort of kind of in the middle. I really didn't know exactly where I should have placed this. This is one of the more confusing ones. As for what the exact middle is, folks, I can tell you with absolute confidence. That is the DR-TR 2B reticle found in the March FX. It is the only one with very bright center dot illumination because this is a dual focal plane scope. That means that the illumination is on the second focal plane, so they could make it a bright dot, and that lovely, lovely Christmas tree is on the first focal plane. So it changes scale, or rather maintains scale, as you increase or decrease the magnification. One issue I had with this optic, very similar to the March Shorty 1-10, was the reticle had a very hard time finding a perfect balance between the center being sharp and the outside edge being sharp. So I got it as close as I could, and I sent it for the entire review. I made a couple of minor changes here and there throughout the course of my tenure with this, but I always found it to be disappointing, just like the March Shorty 1-10. However, as far as a reticle goes, I don't think you could do or ask for much more than what this thing has to offer. Ever so slightly on the precision end of the spectrum is the VIII-CTR reticle found in the Vector Continental 2-12. This could be right smack dab there in the middle, along with the March reticle and the Athlon, but the center dot and that center segmented circle is just a little bit too fine. Maybe if they just increase the cross section of that segmented circle just a little bit and maybe focus the illumination on just this dot and the circle, it would really change the dynamic. But this is still an extremely nice reticle for precision work that can still function at being fairly quick at the lower magnifications at relatively close targets. It's still more than capable, but it's definitely on the precision side of things because of the overall design layout. However, that language that it's speaking is quite elegant. The Extreme X1 reticle found in the IRAW Valdata 2-16 is actually quite nice. I'd actually probably put it a little bit closer to the center, but I do prefer the CTR reticle found in the Vector a little bit more. This, though, is still pretty competent and capable at the lower magnifications, which is actually impressive given that this is a 2-16x optic. It's the second largest spread that we have after the March. When we increase the magnification to full, though, it's actually quite good. But I think some people will still complain that the center dot is a little bit too large. And in this case, given that this thing goes so high up in the magnification, I could maybe get that, but not really. It's still definitely set up much more for precision, and it works quite well in that regard. It's just the rest of the scope that lets this thing down. Next up is the Recce reticle found in the SwampFox products. This is looking through the WarHawk 2-10, and as you can see, those posts at 3, 6, and 9 are very large, but very short. I guess I should have called them thick and short. Anyway, the center part of the reticle favors much more towards the precision side of things, obviously, but the illumination definitely helps it being from all the way at the very bottom. The short posts really do struggle here, as does the way the line layout works. I was finding myself getting on target, on smaller targets, trying to be as fast as I can without the aid of illumination, and I kept on missing where the center point was. The lines on the elevation hold going up on the reticle, which would be down in the actual, dialing of the scope, I just felt they were a little bit too thick, and I kept on getting confused of where I was. I'm sure it's something I could train out, but the reticle, I think, could still be tweaked a little bit to make it even better. The STL found inside the H6Xi 2-12 from Steiner is very fine. The posts at 369 are full length, which is great, but they are very thin. The illumination on this scope is actually pretty good, but the center part of the reticle where it actually tries to illuminate is very, very thin. And even here at its maximum magnification, that tree looks a little bit on the cluttered side. I found that using this at distances of around 600 yards with this tree style reticle, it was okay, but I really do feel that this reticle is designed for a 3-18, a 5-25, hell, maybe even a 5-30, and then was just sort of shoehorned into this 2-12. It's one of the most annoying reticles that's here because it could be so much better, but it just isn't. The MOA and Mill Precision Tree reticle found in the Credo 2-10 is, I feel, a slightly better version of it, but they're still both about the same. The only difference is the posts at 369 are a little bit thicker on this reticle, but they're a lot shorter. But I feel like when you bring this up to the maximum magnification, it might be just a little bit easier to make sense of. Basically, this and the STL are very close to being the exact same style of reticle, and it's unfortunate, but they sort of just live in limbo, like stuck in between different magnification ranges. Just because the Mil XT found in the NightForce NX8 is at the very end of this segment does not mean it is the worst. In fact, far from it. It just means that it is not set up for speed style shooting, which is kind of upsetting given that this is a 2.5x minimum scope where you think, hey, maybe I'd actually want to use this thing at fairly close ranges. If you do, go with a different reticle. You can get a couple of different options with the NX8, but if you are buying the Mil XT, I would say you bought yourself an IPVO that's going to be useful in the 4-5 to 20x magnification range. However, once you start cresting past 10x, the reticle really does dump a massive amount of information on you. If you are the type of person that likes holding for your shots, whether it's wind, elevation, or a combination of both, this is the most insane reticle of the bunch. It's gorgeous. It's almost too busy. For myself, having ADHD, I get lost looking at this thing every once in a while. That's why I prefer things like the AMHR2, the TMR, the Milgap, the G2B. Things like that are more my speed for this magnification range. But the NX8 is different because it goes up to 20x, where a reticle like this Mil XT, I feel, is much more usable. So, this might not be the best reticle for the lower magnifications, but for the higher magnifications, this is by far and away, I think, the best one. Before we move on to the tracking segment of this section, I wanted to just really drive home and stress that all the reticles that I just talked about in the order that I gave them are my opinion. A lot of people will listen to people's opinions and just say, well, you're wrong, that's not what I think. Okay, good for you. That's your opinion and the other person's opinion. You might hate the reticles that I like, or you might like the things that I like. It's just a roll of the dice and what your personal preferences are. But for the magnifications that we are speaking of, I think finding a faster to more balanced reticle is the better option for this magnification range. If you want a finer reticle for more precision work, go with a larger magnified optic. It really is that simple. But you know what, see, give me a duplex. I'd rather have that, and give me a good set of turrets that I can dial up for my elevation and wind holds. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we are going to take a very quick look at how most of the scopes that we just looked at
track. Again, keep in mind, this is a serving size of 1. I've only really had one of each optic to test, and it could have been a fluke that it performed good or bad either which way. Anyway, to keep things consistent, we are going to start again with the Athlon Helos BTR Gen 2. What I'm doing here is just taking screen grabs of all of my track and test videos just to simplify it and show you exactly what they look like at their maximum elevation gain. Now, halfway through most of these, I started from my 10 mil original target, and I accidentally made a new one that was 9 mils, so keep that in mind. With the Athlon Helos BTR Gen 2, that is a 9 mil target, and we were still about 2% off. However, it was consistent and repeatable. Next up is the primary Arms GLx, and from what I could tell, it was about 1% off, maybe a little bit less than that. It was a very impressive performance. Another old scope that performed extremely well with the tracking was the PST Gen 1 2.5 to 10. However, it only managed to increase 8 mils of elevation. The reason why the image on the Burris XTR II looks so blah is it had a minimum parallax of 50 meters, where we're at 41 yards. Regardless of that, it was still about 2% off, but going short, not going long. Typically, I find that you'll be plus 2%. In this case, it was negative 2%. I could actually wrap up the two SwampFoxes again because the Kentucky Long, as seen here, is a perfect 0% on the tracking test, as is its bigger brother, the WarHawk 2 to 10. Both of these are excellent performers when it comes to tracking. The Vector Continental was about 2% off at the worst, but more like 1.5 or so. Either which way, it's still pretty average. The Mk5HD was another slightly off performer at about 1.5%, but again, keep in mind, this and the Continental were at 9 mils, not 10. Fortunately, though, if you're spending the big bucks on a Leupold, just know that the Mk5HD tracks perfectly fine. As does the Credo 2 to 10 by 36. Again, the image is blurry here because that is a fixed parallax setting, and we are well inside of that. From solid performers to worse performers, the Steiner H6Xi, with its current 0, which is the same 0 I run all of my scopes at, couldn't even hit 7 mils of added elevation, and even when it did hit really close to 7 mils, it was 1.5% off, which was very not great. However, the NightForce NX8 2.5 to 20 was absolutely flawless. In fact, I would say that this was the best performer of the entire bunch. It was breathtakingly nice. Despite my harsh criticism of the IOR Valdata 2 to 16, it does track pretty good, about 1% across 10 mils. I've tracked a few US optics, but the MR10 was about 1% off max. It could have probably been even less than that, but due to the limited magnification, it's a little bit tricky to find that half a tenth or so. Again, last but not least is the March FX. Now, it does look like it's favoring the right-hand side because it was slightly cocked, and I couldn't get it any better than that. But across 10 mils of elevation where it's currently stopped, it was absolutely flawless. No surprise there. So as you can see, the worst performer we had was the Steiner H6Xi at 1.5% at about 7 mils, but everything else was no worse than 2%, and most of them held the windage line fairly fine. So ultimately, all of these are going to be really close to one another if we were to dial them out at distance, which maybe will be something we're going to take a look at the end of this video.
I am rather looking forward to this analysis, aren't you?
Keeping with the same consistency and flow, we are now going to start the sharpness and resolution part of this review. And we're going to look at all the scopes we just previously looked at, starting with the least expensive, working our way to the most expensive. For this segment, we're going to be focusing primarily here at large bore because I have footage on all of the scopes that we just talked about here. Granted, they were all at different parts of the year. Hell, sometimes even years apart, but it'll give us a good idea of how some of these scopes perform optically here at these distances, maxing out at 300 yards. We're going to start at the 100-yard line with the Athlon Helos BTR Gen 2, and already that reticle is super easy to pick up. Some of these videos I remembered to set the parallax before increasing the magnification. Some of them I did not. With the Helos, I really don't believe that I did. Some of the main things that I want to focus on are not just how sharp the image can absolutely be. We're going to be looking at purple and green fringing. That is a green or purple line that goes on very high contrast surfaces, like that backing target to the brown berm, for example. But I also want to look at the depth of field. Those reads are probably about 60 yards. The steel targets behind the paper targets are about 180 to 190 yards. So we can use that as a reference point on how good the depth of field is on all of these scopes at varying magnifications. At 12x on the Athlon, you barely even really need to touch the side parallax to go from 100 to about 180 yards. And when we get to even farther extended ranges, you'll see that that's something that this scope performs extremely well at. In fact, a lot of the scopes in this magnification range of the 2 to 10 variety are actually very good with having a very large depth of field, which for a lot of people is great. For myself, it's nice because I don't have to worry about fine-tuning my side parallax all of the time, moving from one target to the next, to the next, to the next at extended ranges. For a lot of other people, more or less precision shooters, you want a shallower depth of field, so you could really fine-tune it to have just your target be in focus. And that way you could really hyper-focus on your target and nothing else, and you could probably spot your splash or your miss a little bit easier as a result. Again, that all completely comes down to personal preference, but one thing that I feel is better suited for a scope like this, which again, I feel is much more focused more toward the speed aspect before the precision aspect of things, I would rather have this scope have a larger depth of field so I don't have to worry about playing around with it as much. The 200-yard paper is great. We do see a little bit of that purple fringing that I was telling you about on the targets at the 3 o'clock and 9 o'clock position. It's really not that bad. It's still there, and if you're sensitive to it, then it's going to be something that you will notice, but it's nowhere near as obtrusive as it is on a lot of other optics. The center dot on the reticle, being 1 MOA, for me on a speed style rifle is perfectly fine. My eye draws right to the center of this thing very quickly, very easily, and you might not really think it, but 1 MOA is not that big, all things considered. You're talking about on a 200-yard target like that, it's only taking up 2 inches of space. And here at 300 yards, it's only taking up 3 inches of space. 3 inches at 300 yards isn't really all that big, in my opinion. But if you prefer something finer, then you're going to be more interested in some of the more precision-focused scopes of this variety. The rest of the reticle, I feel, is also very well situated. The drops are very easy to read, see, and figure out. Some of the other scopes we're going to look at very soon, that's not going to be the case. I purposely left this segment as full length as possible so I can get all of my explanations out of things that I want you to look for as we start progressing down the list, because I'm not going to have a 12-minute segment per scope. It's not going to be feasible. Most of these scopes already have full reviews. If not, all the other scopes that we're going to talk about are going to have full reviews eventually. So if you want a more in-depth discussion about a particular scope, either go watch the previous review or wait until I finish the new ones. With that being said, let's move on to the next scope, which is going to be the Primary Arms GLx. One thing I didn't talk about with the Athlon was the scope profile and the view looking through it. The Athlon has a fairly small scope profile, meaning we see a very small amount of body around the scope, but it also has a fairly large view looking through it. It's a really nice balance between the two. Some scopes do this better than others. Some scopes do this way worse than others. For you, it might not make a difference either which way, and I completely get that. For me, the larger view I can have through it without sacrificing depth of field or eyebox, and the smaller scope profile that I could have, the better. But that's not always necessarily going to be the case. The GLx has a fairly small scope profile, but it also has a much smaller view looking through it. As you can see, we have the entire view of the scope on screen, whereas with the Athlon, it was cropped slightly. Some manufacturers do this on purpose, so this way they can keep the resolution of the glass a little bit higher. The analogy I like to use is pretend you download a very small JPEG picture and you blow it up to print on, a poster. It's going to be pixelated, it's going to be grainy. Same sort of concept applies here. The smaller the view looking through it, the tighter they could try to pack the glass. Anyway, with all that being said, the reticle on this GLx, you might love it, you might hate it. If you really do want to find one of these, you're going to be hard-pressed to find the exact reticle that you want. The center chevron, unfortunately with the illumination on full here, sort of just fades away on a dark target. But it's still large enough that at the lower magnifications, we can very easily pick it up. And on a speed-style rifle, again, I think it's more than fine. However, if you do start dialing to use this top of the chevron as being your hold point at distance, you'll see it's a little bit more challenging because that chevron starts taking up a lot of space. The dots underneath the chevron, where we have the Christmas tree as it would be called, I feel is also very well laid out. We can see the numbers on the far side on both sides, and the dots are a decent size. I think maybe if they were a little bit bigger, it'd be a little bit easier to pick up, but if you're looking more for a scope that you're going to probably just hold for, the tree-style reticle on this is actually quite nice. It gives you a nice fine aiming point, but it's still fairly easy to pick up, even at slightly lower magnifications. At 200 yards, you can see what I'm starting to talk about. That center chevron takes up the full width of the target and half the height. That's pretty significant. For people that complain that the Athlon had too large of a center dot, they're not going to be interested in this optic whatsoever because of the chevron. And I totally get it, because it does take up a lot of space. With that being said, though, optically this thing actually produces a very good-looking image. There is a little bit of pulling to the outside edge, but very low chromatic aberration or purple fringing. The center of the image definitely gets fairly sharp, but it does taper off slightly. Depth of field on it's also pretty good. I didn't really find the need to have to constantly adjust it to get a good image, which partly lays into probably how small the view looking through it is. I think that definitely correlates in some way, shape, or form. Overall, optically, this thing isn't half bad. The PST Gen 1, however, I think optically is wonderful. In fact, it's the main reason why I held on to it for as long as I did. But look at how much scope body we see looking through this thing. It is gigantic. I was going to say gigantic and gargantuan at the same time, and that's how it came out. So I'm going to leave it in there, folks. Everyone needs a good laugh every once in a while. Reticle on this, the EBR, is a little bit hard to see at the lower magnifications, but increasing it all the way to its maximum, it is fairly nice. Illumination on full is just barely noticeable. Sharpness, resolution, and clarity on this glass, though, is exceptionally high. Depth of field is exceptionally large. It was beautiful. Absolutely beautiful. The reticle, I think, could be a little bit thicker. Not as thick as the TMR, which you'll see soon, but a little bit thicker would really have aided it in the lower magnification range. But beyond that, it's stellar. It's really, really pretty. Really pretty glass. The Filipinos really know how to put together a pretty good scope. The GLx is made in the Philippines. The PST Gen 1, as seen here, is made in the Philippines. And there's just something about it. Some of them could be really, really good. On low contrast areas like this, gray steel on light brown, you could pick up everything that's going on in the berm, despite how much mirage we have from how hot it was when I filmed this. I really can't fault this. It's wonderful, and the edge-to-edge sharpness is insanely good. Look how good that 100-yard target looks as we're focused at about 190 yards. It's almost good enough that I wouldn't even need to adjust the side parallax. The ability that this scope has to also look through the air and bypass some of the mirage is also quite high. Unfortunately, I don't have video proof of this on every single scope, because sometimes I only have a scope in the dead of winter where you might not notice it as much, or spring and fall is actually usually the worst. Summer and winter is probably the best time for the mirage, but definitely the summer when it's 100 degrees out and humid. Again, do you see anything about this image that you'd want to see changed? Absolutely not. The reticle's a little bit harder to pick up on more complicated targets where there's a little bit less of a background that you could really focus on. Focusing at a piece of steel like this, the center part of the reticle does get lost a little bit, but it's definitely not useless. At 300 yards, didn't even have to touch the side parallax. I do anyway, and I basically put it right back where it was. The optical performance of this scope, despite the fact that it's, probably over a decade plus old at this point, and only has a 32mm front objective, is extremely high. One area where this did lack was overall maximum brightness coming through. It definitely struggled in lower light environments, but as far as a resolution aspect is concerned, the scope is phenomenal. Our third Filipino scope in a row, it is the XTR II. And unlike the previous two that we just looked at, the view through this scope is very large and the scope profile is way more on the smaller side. Let's see how that's going to directly affect our overall image. Well, focusing at 100 yards, I'd say the center is pretty sharp, but it does seem to be soft on the extremes at 3 o'clock and 9 o'clock. And the reads in front don't look as sharp as the 100-yard target, nor does the berm in the back. And keep in mind, this and the other two scopes we just looked at were both maximum 10x scopes. Both the GLX and the PST Gen 1 performed much better in this regard. Focusing on a small aerosol can on a brown berm at about 180 yards, and the center looks pretty good, and the 100-yard target looks okay, but then that tree in front, which is even closer than the reeds, is actually in more focus. I don't get it. I didn't get it when I was behind the scope. I don't get it now. There was something about the scope that I just felt was a little bit on the lacking side, and I think to increase the view looking through it, they sacrificed a little bit of the overall optical performance. The G2B reticle, though, I feel is a very fine choice for a mild hybrid between speed and precision. It's fairly easy to pick up. It might be a little bit fine at the center. However, the posts at 3, 6, 9, and 12 o'clock are thick and full length, and it really does aid bringing your eye right to the center. I don't know why more scope companies don't do this. The 200-yard paper performance also isn't really stellar. I mean, sure, the image looks pretty good, but it just doesn't have the overall maximum sharpness and resolution as the PST-1 or even the GLX in my opinion. However, there is no purple fringing or green fringing of any sort. It was good in that way, but it just never seemed as sharp as it should have been. And out at 300 yards, we see more of the same. And keep in mind, folks, it was a beautiful, bright, sunny day, basically perfect conditions for filming, and it still just didn't really impress me. That's the main reason why I sold it. I liked a lot of what it had to offer, but as an overall package, I felt that it was a little coddled together, and it definitely showed its age. I would love, love, love if Burris would bring out an XTR 3 or 4 version of this with a couple of minor changes. I really think it could be something special, but this one's just not it. I'm going to talk very briefly about the Kentucky Long 2-12 before I start talking way more in depth about the Warhorse or Warhawk, Warcow, whatever. The other one. They both feature the Recce reticle, but I wanted to at least show you what the view looking through this is like and the scope profile. Scope profile is a little bit on the thicker side. View through it's a little bit on the smaller side, but not terrible. Overall sharpness and clarity of the glass is honestly pretty decent, but I think the Athlon is a little bit better than it. But this still falls way shorter of what we're going to look at with its larger brother. I left this video slightly overexposed when I was filming with it, and it doesn't show as much detail as is possible, but it still gives you a pretty good representation of what's going on. Depth of field on this thing is still pretty high. The reads are pretty clear, the target is pretty clear, and the berm is pretty clear. So a very good performance in that regard. The Recce reticle has a very fine centered dot, and I do like the windage and the elevation. However, I think the Christmas tree beneath it is a little bit too fine. It looks a little bit too cluttered. I think if they just focused on full mil dots as opposed to full and half mil dots, it would clean it up a lot and probably help draw your eye to where what dot you need to be on. Because if you look at this thing really quickly, it gets a little bit confusing. We're going to skip right to the 300-yard section because I want to talk about its bigger brother more. A lot of mirage this day. This is one of the days where it was really cold out, but the sun was really hot, and it made this happen. Despite the mirage, the image looks pretty decent. I would say the edge-to-edge sharpness is very high, and so is the depth of field. Chromatic aberration was a little bit, but nowhere near as bad as what we have seen or will see, but overall, not a bad performance. As decent as the Kentucky Long is, it cannot hold a candle to its big brother. This 2-10 really does encapsulate a lot of what I would like in a more precision-focused optic of this kind. We have good sharpness, we have good clarity, we have great depth of field, and the reticle, again, it's too much of a personal choice for me to say whether or not you're going to like it, but I definitely will give my critiques. But overall, optically, this scope is fantastic to get behind. It is really good, like really, really good. Better than it has any right to be. I feel that it's actually one of the better overall glass experiences of the bunch. I know that's a pretty bold statement for me to claim, but proof is in the pudding. You'll see for yourself, because I filmed this scope with all of the other 7 other scopes in the exact same day at the exact same time, so you'll be able to see for yourself. Overall, though, this scope does a fantastic job even on low contrast targets like that. The only complaint I could say is that there is a little bit of purple fringing on some high contrast targets. That's about as bad as it's going to get. It's really not as in your face as a lot of other options, but again, I have to talk about it if I experienced it, and you very clearly can see for yourself. Depth of field with the reeds, 200-yard target, and probably about 130-yard berm behind that is also quite good. At 300 yards, it's more of the same. Didn't even really need to touch the side parallax. I adjusted ever so slightly and ended up going right back to where I was. It's exceptionally good, extremely good. Contrast on the brown leaves in the back, on some of the twigs and the sticks and the logs that are behind it is very, very good. My friend is law enforcement, and I want to say that he bought this thing for like $300 and something, which, if that's true, even if it's $400, it's really good optics for the price. And it tracks flawlessly, as you saw, and it's got a large view looking through it and a fairly small scope body. It's a really nice package. Next up is the hotly anticipated Victor Continental 2-12. This is $599 before my discount code, which is a very good price. And so far, I've been very impressed with what I've experienced with Vector as a company and with some of their products. For the price, I wouldn't even consider looking at their lower tier stuff, only because their highest tier stuff is not that much more expensive, all things considered. But let's see if this thing can wow me the way that the 1 to 8 second focal plane did. The CTR reticle is definitely much more set up for precision. At 2x, it is pretty hard to find, and the illumination is on full. However, increasing the magnification to its maximum of 12 yields a very good looking center. I dial up the parallax to make sure it's 100% perfect, and that center looks absolutely fantastic. And even though we're at 12x, as opposed to most of the other scopes, I should say, have been 10x so far, the depth of field on this thing is still quite impressive. The reeds are pretty sharp. The target at 100 yards is very sharp. And the targets in the berm are also very sharp. The edge-to-edge sharpness, the targets at 3 o'clock and 9 o'clock are a little bit out of focus, but the center is very sharp and clear. Things change around a little bit when we focus at 180 yards on this piece of steel. The targets at the 100-yard line are a little bit out of focus, but still not out of the realm of usable if you had to transition from that target that we're focusing on to one of those. I think it has very good contrast with low contrast targets. We could see a lot of what's going on with the berm. Again, though, the depth of field starts to shallow out the farther out we go. Pulling it back to 10x, and that does increase a little bit, so we do have a little bit more depth of field and a little bit more sharpness on those targets, but not by a drastic amount. At the 200-yard paper, we have a phenomenal looking image. Very sharp, clear. You can spot a lot of the bullet holes in the shoot and see targets. Very low purple or green fringing to basically non-existent. You can see a little bit at 3 o'clock, but other than that, it's basically gone. Depth of field gets a little bit hard to see up down at 6 o'clock, but you can see the reeds are a little bit out of focus now that we're really focusing on the 200-yard paper target. But the berm behind the 200-yard target is very sharp and clear. And at 300 yards, we have more of the same. Illumination here, you can see it just makes it bright enough where you can distinguish the reticle from the targets. This scope of all the scopes so far is the best setup for overall precision work. The reticle, the drops on it, the center, everything about this reticle I think is great for precision work. If the center segmented circle and the center dot was a little bit larger, I think it would really be able to fit more of the middle ground, similar to with what we see with the Athlon. But overall, this thing is a tremendous performer so far for precision work. Our first and only second focal plane option is the Credo 2.5 to 15. This is the biggest difference with second focal plane versus first focal plane. Obviously, the reticle does not change size. What that means is as you increase or decrease the magnification, the scaling will change because the reticle doesn't. It's that simple. If you wanted to use the reticle for precise holdovers, unless you were very good at putting a particular magnification setting on, like let's say hypothetically 6x, if you put it to 6x consistently, then you could kind of figure out where to hold. But to use the drops as how the drops were intended, you have to be here at 15x. Now the image on this thing at 15x honestly isn't terrible, and the illumination is also pretty good. But you start losing things like exit pupil size, eyebox tightness. You start losing some depth of field, even though here it's honestly not that bad, but it's not the best setup for a lot of people. If you are solely going to be using this for hunting, however, that's not going to be the biggest worry because the reticle will always be kind of easy to see and consistent, at least on its size. So it'd be easier for you to reference and pick up. However, this thing doesn't have a locking elevation turret, and it's a little bit on the bigger side. So is it really going to be best suited for hunting? Probably not. At the 180-yard steel berm, I feel that it's also not great. I think it loses a lot of resolution, at least at 15x, but it also doesn't seem to work great with the low contrast areas. I feel like there's not enough information in this image to really like, oh wow, okay, that's why I would go with a second focal plane as opposed to a first focal plane. Again, this is a serving size of 1. Maybe the scope had an issue, but we could talk about Trijicon and that very soon. The 200-yard shoot and sees have enough information that you could see a lot of the smaller details on it, but it just doesn't seem like it has the overall clarity to the glass. The glass looks a little bit muddy, and unfortunately that was as good as I was able to get this scope. It sort of just sat in limbo in my opinion. Being second focal plane though, the illumination honestly isn't bad. I did increase the exposure a little bit so we could see the targets because they were under very heavy canopy shadows. But again, the image just seems milky to me. I know the conditions in the summer is humid. You could see on the outside that there's a little bit of haze to the air, but not a lot, not enough to really have the image look like that. Overall, I really wouldn't pick the scope, nor would I really recommend it to anybody, but if it works for you, it works for you. Speaking of Trijicon products that disappoint, we're going to look now at the 2-10x36. First focal plane, non-side parallax adjustable, and non-locking elevation turret. A lot of people, I think, criticized me for not liking this scope because I flat out don't like this scope. I actually had 2 of these. The first one that I bought, I had the optical issues with it. I sent it to Trijicon. They were very quick to reply and say, hey, we found a problem with it. We sent you a brand new one. And when I received the brand new one, it performed exactly the same. To touch on the 100-yard paper, it looks pretty decent, but not, oh my god, that's very sharp. The read, you could see the single one dancing around the 6 o'clock position on the reticle is not bad, and neither is the berm behind it. It's not great, but it's not amazing, and that's as good as it's ever going to get. But we're not at 10x yet. Now we are. And I feel it still doesn't perform great. I mean, the 100-yard paper looks good, but the berm behind it a little bit lacking, and we can't really see any reads in front of us, so we're going to have to just take it for what it's worth. The center target looks pretty good, and the reticle looks okay. I think it's way too fine for this magnification range. Even at 10x here, it's a little bit hard for me to spot the Christmas tree section, especially with those tiny little numbers off to the side, but at least they numbered it. But I really do feel here it's an okay performance in some regards. Shifting our attention now to the steel plates on the berm at 180 yards. Again, the image looks usable, but it's nowhere near as sharp as I feel that it should be. Contrast is definitely on the lower side. It's just sort of like a brown mess in the middle. You can't really pick out every fine little detail there. And keep in mind, again, it was a very bright, beautiful day, almost perfect conditions for filming. Even when I filmed this segment originally, I didn't even bother with the 200-yard paper because I'm like, I know exactly how it's going to perform. Let's go farther out. And at 300 yards, you can see the targets behind the trees. They're blah. They're muddy. The tree there is muddy. The trees behind it are just muddy and soft. They're out of focus. And I did, in the reprise review of this optic, adjust the rear eyepiece to try to get it a little bit better. And I was able to find that I could get it good for the reticle or good for the image, but never really both. It sat in limbo. And you can imagine how it would look at even farther distances. I think just the lack of side parallax and the really fine reticle did the scope in. I think if they had put a side parallax on it and gave it a better reticle, that it would have performed better, but then it still wouldn't have even had a locking elevation turret. So it's really a mishmash of parts, I think, that landed about as gracefully as a plastic bag full of mud. I'm sure at least one of you out there is saying, but see, of course it's not going to perform good. It doesn't have an adjustable side parallax. Let me prove you wrong. Let me finally introduce the Leupold Mk4HD 2-10 by 42 in the first focal plane illuminated TMR reticle. The TMR reticle is insanely nice to use at minimum magnification. It's so easy to spot and pick up. It's great with or without illumination. It's excellent for speed work. But what happens if you care about actually possibly doing a little bit of long distance shooting? Well, we're going to find out how that works very soon. But what I want to show you is just how good the glass is on this thing. Those posts out there are very close. 2.5x, perfectly sharp and clear. Let's crop the image and really pay closer attention now. Ah, yes, there we are. Can you see any sort of focus issues with this so far? No, you don't. Even at 10x, do you see any focus issues with the targets at 100 yards, whether the center, left, or right? No, you don't. How about the reeds at 60-ish yards? No, you don't. How about the steel on the berm behind the targets? No, you don't. You also see a ton of little dirt and debris on that berm where you could pick out oh, what's a twig and what's a log and what's a rock and what's a piece of steel. Oh my goodness, ladies and gentlemen, if there is one scope that has blown me away, it is the Mk4HD and its optic performance. I don't know how they did it, but they did it. Every single time I get behind this scope, I go, wow. No matter what the magnification is, no matter what the distance is, it is simply stunning. Say what you would about the TMR reticle, it is very easy to pick up and read, but I would like to see some minor modifications. Leupold, if you're listening, which I know you're not because you don't care about me or this channel, or developing your products to be great. I've actually just heard a rumor, I don't know how true it is, but Leupold is looking at changing the glass in the Mk4HD to possibly something that's going to be subpar. Definitely worse than this. I can't imagine it could be any better. If it's going to be better, please, by all means, that would be amazing. But we can't all have Mk5HDs. Some of us can't afford that, nor are some of us willing to spend the money on that. But here, though, this is an amazing little package. Amazing little package. Ironically, that's also what my wife tells me all the time, but I make do with what I got. At the 200-yard paper targets, you will see some chromatic aberration or purple fringing popping up at the target at 3 o'clock. It's absolutely noticeable, but it's definitely not jarring. The reeds at 6 o'clock and the berm at 230-ish yards, everything is sharp, clear, and in focus. Talking about the TMR reticle, a couple things that I would like to see at least modified if you were to keep the TMR reticle more or less the same. Put numbers next to the drops. Because there's only a number at 10 mils, I'd really like it if it was at every 2 mils or even every 5 mils. That was my biggest complaint with this thing at extended ranges, which we'll be looking at soon. But let's focus here at 300 yards on this paper. I don't think you could really ask for much more of a scope that doesn't have a side parallax. The H6Xi, I've gotten questions on from multiple different sources every single day. How is it? How is it? How is it? How is it? It's good, but it's not a great cohesive package in my opinion. The reticle, the STL reticle, insanely fine at 2x. Invisible to the naked eye. The posts at 3, 6, and 9 are decent, definitely better than some. At least they're full length. But if they weren't full length, then they'd be basically invisible again at 2x. But a lot of people aren't going to use the scope at the minimum magnification, and if they do, it's not going to be, any sort of shooting work. Maybe it's just more of like a panning work, or you want to try to get a little bit better target identification. The one thing that the Steiner has going for it, though, is it has a huge view looking through it and a fairly small scope profile. Optical sharpness, I would say, is pretty good to better than good. Depth of field at 12x is also pretty high. The reads, the target, and the steel in the berm behind it are all in pretty sharp focus. It's honestly very good for a 2 to 12. But the reticle still does not fill me with confidence or enthusiasm. I think it's still way too fine. I think the hold markings on the Christmas tree section are a little bit hard to pick up. Even the large crosses, they made them crosses so this way that they'd stand out against the circles and the dots, but they just don't seem to be doing an amazing job. I really feel that this reticle is better suited for a much higher magnification range. Not even like a 3 to 18. I mean like a 5 to 25 or a 5 to 30 is probably where this reticle was designed for, but then they just shoehorned it in this scope. And I don't really like it when companies do that. Some companies do, but if Athlon can do it, Steiner can do it, Leupold should do it, but they don't. Athlon's a little Chinese company. They make one of the best reticles as far as making this magnification range a very capable and cohesive package. Hell, even Vector with the CTR does a much better job of being noticeable, but still very precision capable. This reticle is just, what are those lines? What are those squiggly lines that I see on the windage holds? What are those supposed to be? Huh? What are they? For many people, it won't be an issue. For many people, it is never going to be an issue. But for some people like myself, it will be an issue. It will be probably such a big issue. It could be the very reason why I don't buy something. When you're spending $1,300-ish on a scope like this, which, by the way, speaking of price, originally these things were like $1,500, $1,600. Now they're readily available for like $1,200 to $1,300. And someone just messaged me about a half hour ago, oh, Amazon's having a special. They're $1,000. Why? I mean, great, cool. You're saving a lot of money, but that's a lot of money. That's a significant amount of money. Are they not selling good, Steiner? Gee, I wonder why. You can probably tell from my voice that I'm getting a little bit frustrated because it's a very frustrating thing to be in my position, constantly looking at scopes and seeing who's doing what and who's doing this and just how they just work together. And I know that this scope could be so much better if it just had a better reticle. Like, that's all it needs. Maybe they'll come out with a different reticle in the future. I really hope that they do. But seeing as how most companies don't really bring out mid-cycle refreshes of reticles before they completely change platforms, I'm not really so enthusiastic that it could possibly happen. I didn't even talk about the reticle or the targets at 200 yards because we're just going to look at 300 and go from there. But at 200, they were okay, a little washed out. Sun changed little positions when I started filming. But all in all, not terrible. But I feel like it could be better. Just like here at 300 yards, it just doesn't have the sharpness that it seemed like it had at 100 or even 180 yards of the berm. It's good, but it's not great. And the reticle is still really hard for me to pick up. It's even if I was focusing on precision, it wouldn't even be this reticle. I think Steiner opted very similar with what Burris did with the XTR II, go with the largest view possible and just sacrifice a little bit. And with the scope, it just seems to be overall sharpness and resolution to the glass. And then the reticle. Oh, and then the turrets, which are non-locking, or you could just run them capped, which is honestly probably how I'd run this. I'd run this capped windage and elevation and just try to use the reticle for holds. But ladies and gentlemen, if you want to do a more precision-focused scope in the 2 to 12-ish range, that's going to cost, $1,300, $1,400-ish dollars. Just spend a little bit more and buy something like the NX8. As a precision instrument, it's a much better optic. It tracks perfectly. You can get a plethora of different reticle options. It still has a capped windage and a non-locking large elevation turret, but it's just a better overall package. The Mk5XT found in this particular optic is tremendously good if you are trying to use your reticle at distance for holding. Unlike with what you just saw with the 2 to 12 H6Xi, this is a very similar style of reticle, but yet look at how much more usable it is here at 100 yards at 20x. I can almost guarantee you that that reticle is going to look this decent at 20x. The Mk5XT, though, I think is flawless for what it's trying to accomplish, give you a lot of information without being too complex. I mean, the way that they went from small to large numbers, intermittent on the sides, all the way down to like 60-something mil, I want to say, and the same thing with the windage holds. It's so well done. Sharpness, clarity, brightness on this scope is tremendously high. The biggest weak link on this scope is the Eyebox. It is definitely on the tighter side. But if you do plan on shooting more precision stuff, you're not really going to be overly concerned about Eyebox because you're going to try to be in a very rigid position anyway. But if you still want that 2.5x bottom end for whatever reason, this is a tremendous optic. Everyone that I've recommended one to has absolutely loved it, and I've contemplated buying one myself, but I just don't really have a need for it because if I do precision style shooting, I'm not trying to shoot for groups. I'm not shooting competitions like PRS. I just go to the range and I like making hits on steel, so I'm not suited. This scope is not tailored for me. But if I wanted a scope that could do this, I would absolutely buy this. It's a great performer. And I don't really think you need much more than 20x in most cases, especially on an IPVO like this. This is definitely on the higher end of the spectrum, but still not out of the realm of possible, again, given its 2.5x minimum. It also does a very good job with dealing with mirage. 200-yard paper target, heavy mirage. You can still see all the bullet holds towards that center diamond. You can see all of the little squares that make up that target at 200 yards. It's very, very good. A couple things I might want to change about this. I'm a stickler for a locking elevation, but honestly, I don't think it's really as important with this particular scope because, again, how focused this is on precision. However, with a Mk5XT reticle, I probably wouldn't even want to dial. But if you did dial, this thing tracked flawlessly. Eyebox is definitely on the tighter side, but the view through it is large and menacing. It's so impressive to get behind this thing. The scope profile is nice and small. So they struck a balance that they wanted, and I really think NightForce hit the nail on the head with this one. There isn't really anything else I'd change about this scope. Overall, as far as more precision focused, this is the one I'd absolutely recommend if you don't mind the higher magnification. So if the Mark IV HD is good, then the Mark V should be better, right? It is. Optically, it's better. The side parallax is really nice. The illumination control is really nice. The TMR reticle is this thing's only real weakness. And the fact that it's twice the price of the Mark IV HD. In fact, I'd actually reckon that the reason why Leupold is looking to change the glass to the Mark IV HD is because they really dug into the Mark V sales. The 3.6 to 18, I know a lot of people that have them and then sell them right away because they're just not as impressive as they should be for the $2,000 to $2,500 price point that these things command. I really do feel that the only reason why some people gravitate towards the Mark Vs is the weight. However, do yourself a favor, internet person, and save $1,000 and some weight and just buy a Mark IV HD. It might not have the same joie de vivre or the same overall feature set, but they're really, really close, and they're way less expensive. But if you're looking for a 2 to 10 that's American made, lightweight, gives you every option that you could possibly ask for, and gives you an image like that, then the Mk5HD is for you. Again, the TMR reticle is the only real weak link. It's better suited for the Mark IV because no side parallax and it's half the price. But for some reason with the Mk5HD as seen here, I have a real hard time with it. It's something that really bothers me. Illumination on this thing is honestly pretty decent, but it's not going to blow you away. But given how thick the reticle is, you don't really need super bright illumination for it. But if you're looking for it, it's not going to be the best option, but it's definitely above average. Now, there are some talks about Leupold bringing out a specific reticle for the scope, and if they did, then maybe that would change my tune on it. But even then, you still have to get over the price point, and there's no way around it. It's very, very expensive. But again, the optical performance on this thing is staggeringly good. Just look at the berm there. You can see every little piece of dirt on that pile of dirt. The steel targets really pop at you. So do the rocks, so do the dark spots. It's very, very good. I wish the 3.6 to 18 was as good as this 2 to 10, because then that would completely change my tune on that optic. Leupold is one of those companies where I really feel like they design a product with no real intentions, and then it comes out really expensive, and they're like, hey, look at what we did. Meanwhile, there's no real solid thought processes that went into it. And then it costs too much, and then it doesn't have all the features that you might like, and it doesn't have a reticle. That's great. It has this and the PR1, I think, only for the Mark IV and the Mk5HDs in these magnification ranges anyway. And it's like one's too thick and one's too fine, and one offers illumination and the other one doesn't. It's like, I don't know what you're doing. What are you doing? What are you doing, Leupold? And then they make something, ironically, like the Mark IV HD, probably by accident, where it's like, oh, wow, this scope's actually a really nice package. Oh, but it's digging into our Mark V HD cell, so let's change the glass on it and probably put crappier glass in it to make it a worse scope, so people want to upcharge. Why? All right, I'm done with my rants. I'm done. This video is already getting too long. 300 yards, Mark V HD, flawless. Wouldn't change anything about it optically or controls-wise, but the TMR reticle at least needs a slight update. Please, Leupold, at least give us that. At least if you're going to spend $2,500-ish on an optic of this magnification range that you want to be American-made and be built really well, at least US Optics offers a lot more options than just what Leupold offers. First off, reticle options. They offer 3 or 4 different options. Granted, they're all kind of similar, but I think that all of them are better than what Leupold offers. And then they also have the ability to literally be used as a hammer to drive nails if you misplace your hammer. And then you have like different colored illuminations. I think, I want to say the FDNs are offered in like red, green, and blue. But they also offer the most gargantuan view looking through them of almost any scope I've ever looked at. This MR10 might be an older model, superseded by the FDN, but I want to say that if it works at least as good as this does, you're in for a real treat when it comes to sharpness, clarity, and resolution. See for yourself. It is exceptionally nice. There is some light distortion to the very far ends of the view looking through it, but the depth of field is quite good. The reticle, the mil gap seen here, is also quite good. I think it's like the perfect blend of the TMR and which was the other one to find? Maybe like the STL. It works really well, and it's a very well set up reticle. You could actually count the drops because those large numbers are there, but they're not so large that they're obtrusive and like disorienting. But I do feel like this is a really good, solid performer in many different ways. But they are going to be heavy. They are going to be expensive, but you're going to be getting something that's pretty friggin' unique. The biggest complaint I had with this was the tunneling, which you saw earlier at 1.8x, where it's not the view looking, it's not the actual magnification, it seems like, it's the view looking through it. And they do that specifically by not putting a mask on their lenses, so this way when you increase the magnification, your view through the scope gets this big and still keeps a very high level of sharpness. So it is by design. It's not a great thing to experience. It's not my favorite thing. I wish they sort of just found like a middle ground. I would have been very satisfied with that. But for me, like, it was just not what I was expecting or looking for. The IOR Valdata 2-16 is the only 2-16 we're going to be looking at. But I guess that's not really that unique for a lot of reasons. First off, I had a lot of reservations with the scope when I first reviewed it, and they still all hold true. I could not wait to sell the thing. It might be able to perform great when it comes to tracking, and it might have a very good image, but the experience of using this optic was miserable. I didn't enjoy any of it. With a really tight eyebox and very coarse adjustments on the rear diopter, I mean, even the slightest little twitch would change how everything looked dramatically. And not just the reticle sharpness, but also the view looking through it and distortion. It was just weird. At 100-yard paper target, it looked pretty good. I mean, there's a decent amount of sharpness there. Again, we had very nice conditions for filming. Depth of field looks pretty decent, but at 16x, it definitely is on the softer side. And some would argue, yeah, but you could just back out the magnification and it would get potentially better. And yeah, you're not wrong about that. But if you can't use a scope at its maximum magnification, like, what's the point? You could see there, the reticle is actually quite easy to still pick up and use. I had no real complaints with that, if I'm brutally honest. But the way that they scaled everything, like they show the 2.5 and the 5 and the 7.5 mil, I just don't get it. Why not just go 2, 4, 6, 8 like everybody else? And I mean, you did it on the top. Look at the reticle at 12 o'clock. 2, 4, 6, 8. Perfect. Why didn't you do that for the elevation drops? I don't know. Steel plate at 180 yards looks pretty good, but for $2,500, I'd want better optical performance than this. The center dot being the size that it is, I actually quite like, but again, that's a personal preference. But overall, this scope just lacks some polish. Unlike the USO, when I filmed with this IOR, they did not have the 300-yard paper target set up, so we're going to spend the rest of this video looking at 200 yards. It is possible of producing a very sharp and clear image, but it's very hard to actually get there. I experienced the side parallax knob was very, very touchy and twitchy, and then just the eyebox was just very challenging and tough. It has some impressive features with it, but overall, as a cohesive package, I don't think it really makes a whole lot of sense, especially for the $2,500 it commands. And then good luck finding an actual good retailer, and then good luck with warranty work. I'd hate to have to try to figure that out and mix that all together, and that's precisely why I sold this thing. Our last scope of the segment is going to be the March FX 1.5-15. This is the only one with, I would consider, day bright illumination, thanks to its dual focal plane reticle. And thanks to its dual focal plane setup, you have a very simple, easy to pick up duplex style reticle here at 1.5x. It's also got the least amount of magnification by a whole half of an x. That's a lot. And as you can see here, it makes a huge difference if you were to scroll back and look at some other scopes that, let's say, had a minimum of 2x. As we crop the image to get it as close to what we've seen with everything else, you will see that the view through this thing isn't as small as I was expecting it to be. It's definitely on the smaller side, but it's not the smallest. But I'm fine with that because the balance that this thing has between the scope profile, the view looking through it, and its overall clarity and optical performance is honestly pretty good. The biggest thing we have to keep in mind, though, is that this is still a 10x multiplied scope. That's a lot. It's a lot of a lot. Maybe even too much. I think that if this thing was maybe an 8x multiplier, it would probably perform even better. But here at 100 yards, you can see we have a very good looking center part of the image. At 3 o'clock and 9 o'clock, we can't really notice that much because we're at 15x. It's just that simple. The reads, though, at 70-ish yards look pretty solid, but so does the main focal point being that center target. The reticle, just like what we saw with the Shorty 1-10, definitely gets soft towards the outside edge at the higher magnifications. I couldn't get it any better than what it is. I definitely favored more sharpness to the center as opposed to the outside edge because the center is far more important. But to use the drops here at 15x, the drops aren't that bad, but you could see that below 4x, they really start to get a little bit soft. Same thing with the windage holds. Outside of 4x, it just gets soft. It's just the nature of the beast with the reticle on this. But the image doesn't necessarily get soft, just the reticle. The steel looks fantastic at the center at 15x, and so does the contrast and so do the colors. But it's a weird in-between where I feel like the story of Icarus encapsulates March and their 10x dual focal plane scopes. They tried to fly too close to the sun and they got burned. Pulling the magnification out to around 10x and you can see, I think this is a much better overall package, much better overall image, both with how the targets themselves look and how the reticle looks. And that's why I said earlier that if this thing was, I don't know, maybe a 1.5 to 10, it would probably be excellent. Because then at that point, the in-between magnifications wouldn't suffer as much as this scope particularly does. What I mean by that is the image stability. As you'll see, it definitely tapers off, just like we saw with the March Shorty. As a result of its flying too close to the sun, we see some pretty heavy purple fringing. It's not just on the outside edge, it's the actual color tone of that target, that backing plate. It's got a slight purplish hue to it, which is what chromatic aberration is. And again, we back out the magnification ever so slightly, and it mostly goes away. It's still capable of producing a fairly sharp-looking image, but I really don't feel like for the price point, it's as sharp or clear as it really needs to be. There are a lot of other options we just looked at. Granted, they're not going to be 10x multiplied scopes, but I don't think you really need to have this scope be a 10x multiplied scope, other than just trying to sell, the scope on big numbers alone. And that's not a great way of selling anything. I mean, sure, people are going to buy a 1,000 horsepower car that costs $200,000, but is it really going to be the best possible sports car or daily driver? No, it's just, hey, look what I have. And unfortunately, I want to say that's how I feel about these Marches. They're amazing examples of a super precision made optic that feel like a jeweled watch, like I said earlier. It's really true. Everything feels so polished and put together, but optically, I'm just not sold on it. What's the point of buying a 1.5 to 15 if you're not going to be able to really use it at their maximums? And then when you're in the in-between magnification, they taper off really quickly when it comes to sharpness and overall usability. It just doesn't make sense to me. Focusing now on our final 7 optics. We're going to continue with the same trend from going from least expensive to most expensive. So again, no surprise, the Athlon Helos BTR Gen 2 is going to be our first one up. These solar panels we're going to look at are from 500 to 1,000 yards, and then the farthest tower that we could see at the edge of the horizon is roughly 2,000 yards away. So it should give us some pretty good information at how well these scopes are capable of resoluting images that far away. At 500 yards, there's no issue with the scope. Everything about it is sharp, clear, and crisp, as much as one could expect for the $500 price point this comes in at. Focusing our attention to the 1,000-yard solar panel, I have not touched the side parallax. I left it exactly where it was for 500 yards, and as you can see, it's really, really close. A little bit of fine-tuning does pull a little bit more sharpness out of the image, but it wasn't necessarily necessary. 1,000 yards, maximum magnification, there's no issues with sharpness. But odds are if you're shooting out at distance, you're going to want to increase your elevation. So instead of using the drops in the reticle, I bring it up 10 full mils. At 10 full mils, maybe there's a little bit of a softening to the image at 6 o'clock, but beyond that, it looks really, really good. There's nothing I can say about this in a negative way. Realistically, I feel that the 2 to 10s and 2 to 12s are going to max out in the 5 to 600-ish yard range anyway. But if you wanted to take these out further, just know that so far, this one is good to go. And just because we can, let's now focus at the very far extreme tower. Again, you can see a lot of the struts that make up the structure for that tower. The side parallax going down to really close. really allows us to fine-tune everything that's about 15 to 20 yards from the camera. But once you get to about the 400 to 500 yard range going out towards infinity, you really don't need to worry about the parallax that much. Just set it and forget it. Next up is the GLx. Before I increase the magnification to the maximum on all the scopes here, I set the side parallax roughly to the distance that we're currently going to be focusing on first, right around 500 yards. I figure if we increase the magnification like we do here with the GLx and the side parallax and everything lines up accordingly, that just means that it's halfway decently put together. The GLx at 500-ish yards represents a very good performance. A lot of information, a lot of good colors. There's no real loss of anything. And adjusting the side parallax, as you see, really doesn't do a whole lot to negate the overall sharpness of the image. If anything, maybe it got a little bit better, but overall, even pulling it out really close towards its minimum, it really didn't change how it looks that much. Again, we're going to focus on the 1,000-yard solar panel and increase to 10 mils of elevation. But before we do that, let's take a look at just how good the image is here. Again, depth of field on this scope is quite good. And fine-tuning the side parallax really doesn't seem to be doing all that much. I love it when a scope is set and forget. But now let's increase the elevation to 10 mils and see if anything happens to the image. Up 10 full mils is very easy with these turrets. You push a button and twist. And yes, we do have some kind of rough shadows that pop up at 12 o'clock, but as you can see, I can adjust the camera up and down, and it takes care of most of that. As far as the rest of the image goes, I don't really see that much of a loss of sharpness or clarity. Everything still looks quite usable and quite good. Fine-tuning the side parallax, again, really doesn't get that much more sharp than what it was originally. Overall, a very solid performance. Focusing our attention down towards the horizon, we have another similar performance to what the Athlon showed us. Very good depth of field, and adjusting the side parallax means that we can really focus on a lot of those bushes that are quite close to the camera. All in all, a very good performance. Going from the GLx to the WarHawk really opens your eyes with how large and in charge the view through the SwampFox is. It is huge. I can't get over how big it is. Nor can I get over how good the glass looks on this thing. At 500 yards, the side parallax is bang on perfect. The tree behind the power tower with the solar panel, the power lines that join everything together. Everything about this image is beautiful. The colors are good. There's no chromatic aberration. There's good contrast on the towers. Like everything about this is just like, how much is this scope? If you were looking at just the glass and got rid of the reticle, you'd have no idea what this thing would cost. You'd probably say $1,500 plus. And you know what? I'd be right along there with you. But let's see if it can keep up the charm by pushing it out to 1,000 yards. And yes, it does. With little effort. In fact, no effort. Didn't even have to touch the side parallax. Again, it's so impressive getting behind this thing, especially when you know how inexpensive they are. But let's now increase the elevation to 10 plus mils and see if there's any dramatic change. The answer? No. I don't think there's any change to the image. Hell, maybe it even got better. How much what does this scope cost? The overall optical performance of the scope is really impressive. Obviously, I'm trying to have you understand that in many ways. It's just really, really good. I would love to see this scope be tweaked in a couple of ways. I highly doubt it'll ever happen, but if it does, I would love to test one of them out. The Vector Continental 2-12. Hotly anticipated by anyone that's in the know with these things actually becoming available. At 12x at 500-ish yards, we have a very good looking performance, though I think I'd give the ultimate overall sharpness just ever so slightly to the SwampFox. But this has 2x more on the top end, which isn't a whole lot. But I love the reticle on this scope. The Recce reticle is not bad, but this is far and away one of the best reticles here. Just like I had done with the previous scopes, the side parallax was set before I increased the magnification, and as you saw, there was no issues with it whatsoever. I'm going to do the same thing here for 1,000 yards, and we're going to see if there's any noticeable difference. Yeah, this thing really needs a throw lever. Not really any sort of difference. Sharpness at the center is excellent. Maybe to the edges at 3 o'clock, 9 o'clock, where you could really see different distances. It's a little bit on the softer side, but a very minor tweak of the side parallax shows a much better looking image. At 0+ mils of elevation, I cannot fault this image whatsoever. The shot glass in this thing, I think, is doing a very good job of keeping everything in line. I really can't argue or complain about it. Are some scopes better performers than it? In some ways, I would say yes, but overall, this thing is an exceptional package. At 10+ mils of elevation, there's no loss of colors, sharpness, or brightness coming through the scope, and the exit pupil does not shift. It is quite glorious. Finally, focusing around 2,000 yards, depth of field on this thing is exceptionally good, as is the ability to focus at very close objects. There's a lot to like about this scope so far, and I've been very excited to get my hands on it. Let's see how much of a difference not having a side parallax makes when we start interchanging at extreme distances. The Mk4HD 2.5 to 10 has so far proven itself to be quite capable inside 300 or so yards, but let's stretch out even further and see how it fares. At the first power tower, yeah, it's basically perfect. Sharpness, clarity, depth of field are all exceptional. The TMR reticle, being here at maximum, is definitely on the thicker side. But again, I don't think it's as bad as people make it out to be, even myself included. But let's see what it looks like at 1,000 yards this time. At 2.5x, everything is in focus, even those bushes at like 10 feet away out to infinity. I don't know what they did with the scope, but if they planned on it being that good, then they did an exceptional job, the engineers. If not, they got really lucky. 1,000 yards, 0 mils of added elevation. What a tremendous looking center part of the image. Even the edge-to-edge sharpness is great. Even the depth of field at the power tower around 650, 700 yards versus the farthest one out to the bottom left. I'm amazed at what Leupold did here. Increasing 10 mils of elevation, the scope laughs at you. It is perfect. No shift to the eyebox, no color loss, no brightness loss, no nothing. It's the exact same image. How did they do this without a side parallax? How could they make the scope this good? Leupold, did you just get lucky with this? I really don't know. So because we don't have a side parallax, we're going to start at 2.5x and then push out to 2,000 yards at 10x. I mean, the proof is in the pudding, right? It's pretty friggin' impressive. Let's see if the H6Xi can hold a candle to what the Mk4HD was just able to produce. At 500-ish yards, we're off to a pretty good start. The center looks solid, but because there are no number markers on the parallax knob for the H6Xi, I sort of have to guess. And when I guess, it could be a little bit off. And I play around with the side parallax knob a lot on this scope. But tickling it just right, we have a very good center part of the image. However, the tree in the background at around the 4 or 5 o'clock position looks a little bit softer than what we've seen with a lot of other options. However, again, this is the second 12x that we were looking at. So maybe the little bit extra magnification has something to do with it. Overall, I can't really fault or knock the image whatsoever, but I do feel like the overall image looking through it just isn't as consistent from one side to the next. It definitely gets softer towards the edge a lot more aggressively than all the other options that we've looked at so far. Again, I want to say that some of that's due to just how large they made the view looking through this thing. Again, half a dozen one, half a dozen the other. It's just what they were looking for. At 1,000 yards with 0 mils of added elevation, we have a pretty good looking image at the center. Depth of field is nowhere near as wide as some of the other options we looked at. Again, it's a 12x. But I now increase the elevation to a maximum of 7 because that's as far up as it would go. All of these scopes are 0 to the exact same specifications, and I can only dial up 7 mils of elevation. When I do dial it up 7 mils of elevation, the image definitely gets softer, but tweaking the side parallax does prove a little bit better. But look at that power tower at 1,000 yards at 12 o'clock and then 6 o'clock, and look at the sharpness that you get at the top part of the hemisphere and the dullness that you get at the bottom. That's not where I want the dullness to be. I want it to be reversed, because if you're probably going to land somewhere, you're probably going to land low, and I want the drops that I might actually try to use to be the sharpest possible point for me to focus on. Oh boy. And then the reticle itself is very hard to pick up here at 12x. Yeah, we're in heavy brush, but most of those drops completely disappear. Fortunately, the side parallax goes down to, I believe, 25 meters or yards, whichever one, but it's still pretty close. So if you do plan on using this in closer ranges, you absolutely can. But even when I get the side focus just right, it still doesn't seem as clear as a lot of the other scopes that we look through. And that reticle, it really just disappears. If any scope was going to do it right, it better be the most expensive one. Well, let's find that out. Just off the bounce, and we are not doing that great. The side parallax needs to be tweaked a fair amount, and even then, we only get really the center part of the image to be really good. The outside looks a little bit off. I'm able to fine-tune a little bit of it out, but I'm still expecting more out of the scope, and it's just not giving it to me. Yes, we're at the highest magnification of all the scopes that we're going to be at here today. Yes, it's got the highest amount of magnifier inside of it. It's a 10x. But I still want more out of these scopes. The March Shorty, I could understand not being that great because it's small, very compact. This is a much larger optic, but I still think it's not large enough to really utilize what they're trying to use on the inside of the scope to make it be what it is. It's like trying to cram 6 pounds of dung into a 5-pound bag. It's like just popping at the seams a little bit. It's not exploding, but it's really close to just giving in. At the 1,000-yard solar panel, it looks pretty good on the center. Mirage is definitely much more apparent, again, because the extra magnification. But let's dial it up 10 mils and see if anything changes. Well, the reticle hasn't changed its overall clarity, which is good. But one thing you can note is that the bottom part of the reticle at 6 o'clock, you can see that the thicker duplex is not perfectly lined up on the smaller, finer first focal plane reticle. And the overall image, when we get back to 15x and adjust the side parallax, looks a little bit dull. I back it out to about 12x, and we do see a bit of an increase in sharpness and clarity. And then I tweak the side parallax even further to get it as good as possible. And it does perform pretty good, but I'm still a big fan of having the entire magnification range be usable, not just 80-85% of it. At 2,000 yards, we have the exact same style of performance. There's nothing that we could really expect differently from this, because if you can't perform great at one distance that's already pretty far out, odds are you're probably not going to deal that good even further. But the Mirage is much higher than it was with the other scopes, so I'm sure that has something to do with it. But regardless, I was not as impressed with this scope as I would have wanted to be. And it's the exact same story with the other two March scopes that I've reviewed over the years.
Ah, Freeman, I see you are in this mess too.
We might as well stay consistent at this point, folks. We're going to go with the least expensive to the most expensive. The Athlon, no surprise here, is really, really good when it comes to actually being able to spot the reticle in these conditions. Panning across the power tower, you can see that, yeah, the image is going to shift through it because we have some magnification to the image. It's 2x. But there isn't a noticeable amount of distortion of any real sort. It's not like you're getting behind this thing and going, wow, like I'm looking through a fish tank on this one. It's actually quite good. As far as the Eyebox goes, at 12x shifting side to side, you can see that it's still a little on the tighter side. Most of these scopes are going to be, but the reticle and the targets behind the reticle stay in very sharp focus. And I'm very happy to report that here at 10x, it performs even better, and it's going to continue to do so all the way down to its minimum. Side to side shifting, we have a little bit more space that we can go. As the eyebox gets a little bit larger, the exit pupil gets a little bit larger. I go to the full extreme on this series as opposed to staying in the center. So I'm going to go all the way to the outside when you could see the shadows and then decrease the magnification to have you visually see the change that's occurring. The Helos does an amazing job with what I dub it image stability, meaning that when you're not perfectly behind the scope, can it still create a good usable image and maintain sharpness to the reticle? It absolutely does. 2x, you could see just how much larger the view through this thing gets as far as how far off to the side we can go. And it really does make for a wonderful shooting experience at any magnification. To make that live for you a little bit more, let's dynamically dance around this thing to show you just how much wiggle room we have. At 2x, you can dance around this thing. It is way more forgiving than it needs to be brutally honest, for the magnification range especially. And even at 5x, it still performs really, really good. The illumination, as you can very clearly see, is quite capable on this scope as well. I don't need the illumination on. I'd actually prefer to have it off if I was to actually shoot in this environment, but I wanted to see if we could notice the illumination when we get off into the shadows. Most of the time, first focal plane scopes, it's not really going to happen, but sometimes it does. And if it does, it's always a nice thing. Before we go to the maximum of 12, we're going to stop here at 10x for a little bit to see how well this is going to relate to other 2 to 10s or 2.5 to 10s going down the line. Ultimately, there's nothing I could really fault with this scope when it comes to eyebox, image stability, and distortion. It's a very solid all-rounder, and it's very clear to see why this was my scope of the year for 2023. You could really get a scale for just how much smaller the view through the GLX is compared to all the other options, with the exception of maybe one other one. It's really, really small, but sometimes the small is mighty, and there is very little distortion at 2.5x. Typically, the higher the magnification, the less the distortion. So this thing being at 2.5 probably means it's going to perform better than most 2x's, for example. Despite the size and thickness of the center chevron and the horseshoe, panning across the brush really made this thing struggle a little bit. At 10x at 2,000 yards, shifting side to side, you could see the reticle maintains a very high level of sharpness, but the image behind it definitely starts to taper off once you go off axis. Not a great performance, but keep in mind this is a very old scope by comparison to everything else in the field, so it's just showing its age a little bit, unfortunately. As far as our ability to shift side to side, we have a fair large amount of room, and it performs pretty good in that regard. At 5x, we see a very similar performance. We have more wiggle room to shift the camera around, but once we get to a certain point, the image falls apart. The reticle stays very sharp, though, which is at least a good thing. But just know that if you do get one of these and you plan on using it dynamically, you're going to have to really focus on making sure that you're squared up behind it rather well. At 2.5x, the eyebox in this thing gets gargantuan. It gets very, very large. And as far as image stability, I can't really see any negatives until we get basically to the point where we can't look through the thing anymore. Even though the 6x multiplier of the Athlon performed very good, it cannot hold a candle to how large and forgiving the eyebox is on this thing at 2.5x. You can walk 3 or 4 feet away from it and still look through it. I say that because I did that. You could get so far away from this thing and still manage to see through it that it makes you wonder how it's even possible. At 5x, it gets a little bit tighter because as we're going to go up, it's going to naturally get tighter. But it's still way more forgiving than most scopes at their minimum. I cannot stress enough how forgiving this thing is forward to back. Side to side is definitely a little bit tight, but forward to back is almost infinite. It's very, very impressive. The illumination is just noticeable just outside the shadows, but overall, it's a pretty good performance. With the WarHawk and the Recce reticle really does get quite invisible in these conditions, but there is some distortion to the image. If you look really closely, there is some pulling towards the edge, indicating a little bit of fisheye. It's not the end of the world, but it's definitely something that you might notice. Despite the fact that the view through this thing is gigantic, we actually have a slightly smaller exit pupil, it seems, than what should be the case. It's still very sharp and clear, both the reticle and the targets downrange, but at 10x it really does feel a little bit tighter than I was hoping it would, especially given how well this thing performs in every other way, shape, and form. As we decrease the magnification, fortunately it gets better, but it never gets great until we get to about 2x. One reason for this is you might have seen it, you might not have seen it, but I talked about it in the full review on this thing. At around the 5 or 6x mark, it gets a little bit of a weird shadow that just pops up out of nowhere, like a weird tunneling effect. And unfortunately, that also plays into the Eyebox experience with it and its overall usability. At 2x, though, it's massive, it's huge. But above 4x or so, it struggles a little bit. Dynamically speaking, at 2x, it's tremendous. You could see the illumination right there in the center, and you can walk around it pretty good. Way more than you'd ever need, but it's not going to match what we saw with the GLx. However, it's not going to be that much better than the Athlon, maybe even not better at all. At 5x, you can see the kind of tightness that I was talking to you about. It seems like it shrinks down right there and sort of inverts itself somehow. It's a very weird phenomenon that not many scopes have, but this one has it in abundance. At 10x, it's about the same performance as we saw at 5x. So despite how big and beautiful the image is through this thing, it suffers a little bit as far as its practicality and usability in the medium magnifications. So the Continental's like the WarHawk, but a 2-12, not a 2-10. It doesn't have the same large view looking through it, but it shares a lot of the same characteristics as far as its overall presence when you get behind it. Its distortion at 2x is very, very minimal, but if you are sensitive to it or you're looking for it, you will see a little bit. But it's far from what I would consider a problem. At 12x, at 2,000 yards, we do have a slightly smaller Eyebox, but it seems to be at least on par with the WarHawk again at 10x, maybe even a little bit better. And its image stability is tremendously good. The shot glass in this thing really is working overtime. Both the reticle and the targets behind it maintain a very high level of sharpness at 12x and here at 10x. I do wish that the reticle had a slightly thicker segmented circle in the middle, but beggars can't be choosers. At 5x, we still have a very similar performance. There's really nothing I can fault with this thing. It performs exactly as one would expect or intend a 2-12 like this to function. It's just a really nice setup package. And dynamically at 2x with the illumination on full, it's pretty good. It's not great. It's nowhere near as nice as it was with the WarHawk in that regard, or even with the Athlon. The Athlon really is a little bit of a unique one in this case, but it's still more than good enough. 5x, it's going to still be quite good. You don't have as much wiggle room side to side, but front to back you have more than enough for anything that you're ever going to use this for. I'm not over-exaggerating with the other scopes, but when you can get 2, 3, 4 feet behind a scope and still look through it, it's really impressive. Is it practical? No. Most of these scopes are going to be more than practical enough, but this one's definitely a little bit on the tighter side, front to back. Side to side, you have a little bit more forgiveness, but a lot of these scopes are going to have that same attribute. The illumination is very clearly visible, but we do not see it into the shadows. Again, we can only hope for so much. But at its maximum magnification, it's definitely on the tighter side, but still more than usable. Again, as long as you understand how the scope was probably intended to be used. Similar to the GLx, the Mk4HD has a smaller view looking through it than most. Its scope profile, though, is definitely on the slightly below average side, and its distortion is also non-existent. Again, being a 2.5 versus a 2, or soon to be 1.5, the more you go up in magnification, the less you have to worry about distortion. And fortunately for the Mk4HD, being a 2.5 to 10 really does have some benefits. At 10x, we have very good image stability. We could shift side to side pretty far, but it's not as forgiving as the best performers here. However, as we decrease the magnification, its performance only gets better and better, and almost by an astronomical amount. You can see at this magnification, we do have some shifting of the reticle and the target, but the center of the reticle stays on target. But it is something to note. I think part of that has to do with just the fixed parallax, because it's the only scope to really showcase that weird sort of movement, but everything still maintains a very high level of sharpness. So half a dozen one, half a dozen the other. As long as the center part of the reticle doesn't shift on your target, you shouldn't have much to worry about, but it is something you will unfortunately notice. That, however, is the worst performance of this scope. Everything else is quite excellent. Just like with the GLX, you could really dance behind this thing. And getting behind it in awkward positions, as I've tested out in the field a couple of times, is a joy. This thing, at all of the magnifications, is easy and fun to get behind. 10x, yeah, make sure you have a decent cheek weld, but 5 and 6x, when I was out at Woodland in really awkward positions, I had zero issues with this scope. At 5x, the illumination is more than bright enough and capable to be seen, partly due to just how thick the lines are. It's a worthwhile combination if you're interested in a scope that's set up more for speed than precision. Going up to 10x, it's not going to be as forgiving as the rest, but it's still more than usable. In fact, all of these scopes are pretty usable when it comes to their overall magnification. With the H6Xi, that STL reticle basically disappears. Even the posts at 3, 6, and 9 sort of fade away really quickly once you start hitting some darker bush. Distortion on this is noticeable at 2x, but not jarring. Most of these will have some sort of flaw if you really look for them. I'm only mainly concerned with the things that really jump out at you that you can't avoid. And with this scope, it's going to be the Eyebox. At 12x, we have a pretty good looking image here. We already saw this earlier, but shifting side to side, you could see we have a very narrow window of what we could actually consider to be usable image. The reticle stays pretty sharp, even though it's so small it's hard to tell, but the target behind it does lose a little bit of sharpness once the shadows start to creep in. Decreasing the magnification to 10x to give you a better representation of how it fares against 10x scopes, and I would say it's still behind most of the 10x optics that we've already looked at. The shadows come on fairly quickly and abruptly, but at least there's no weird kidney shapes that pop up until we get to about the 7 to 5x magnification range. That is a way that the new convex lenses are being utilized in scopes. They create weird shadows. So as we go to the right in this case, the shadow will creep up on the left and vice versa. Typically, your shadows would come on the side that you're going towards. So if you're favoring the left-hand side, that's where the shadows would come from. But on some lenses, it's the opposite, and it really makes the overall experience seem way worse than it should be given a more traditional style lens. And that's something I noticed with the scope. Dynamically behind this thing is pretty decent up until we get to about 5 or 6x. The 2x is pretty good, but again, it's only going to allow you to get behind it. Finding the reticle is a completely different story. Yes, the illumination is on full, but the reticle is so fine at the middle that it's almost impossible to pick up the illumination unless you get behind it. It's not the brightest, but you've already seen how all the other scopes have fared in these exact same lighting conditions, and I feel that most of them perform better than how this performs. I really would love to see Steiner make a reticle that's going to fit this magnification range, but they just won't. I don't think they're going to do it. I mean, hell, they're still using the SCR in their T6 series of scopes. I don't get it. Around the 8 to 10x mark is when we finally start to see the illumination with any sort of confirmation, but you could see how much tighter the Eyebox is getting. Forward to back is much tighter than it really should seem. And unfortunately, it just takes away from the overall experience of using this thing in a position other than off of a square bench with a perfect cheek weld. At 12x, it's very tight, the tightest of the bunch, bar none. And again, it really does pull away from the overall experience of using this thing. The March FX definitely is on the smaller side of the views looking through it, but it's a good proportion between the scope body and the view looking through it. At 1.5x here, you can see that there is a little bit more pulling to the outside edge, meaning that there's a little bit of fisheye going on with this glass. The illumination and the reticle are basically flawless. I can't knock them at all. Even if I could, I probably wouldn't because they're just so well set up. Unfortunately, having a 10x multiplier and a 15x maximum magnification is going to yield some interesting results. At 15x here, you can see just how fast and how aggressive those shadows creep in. Stability on the reticle is decent at the center, but the outside of the image and the outside of the reticle really falls apart quickly. Look at how aggressive the kidney shadows are kicking in. Those are the same ones that we saw with the Steiner, but way more noticeable here. As we step it down to 10x, it's still very, very, very tight. Way tighter than every other scope that we've looked at. It almost seems like those shadows creep up the second that you get off the center. Decreasing it even further yields now an even worse result, because look at how horrible the actual reticle looks against the target in the background. It falls apart so bad in between magnifications. And look at that. Look at that. That's like 3x right there. That's about 2.5 to 3x. And it's just, what is going on with this thing? You go slightly off center and it completely falls apart. The exact same experience that I had with the Shorty 1 to 10, where the 1x was good, the 10x was all right, but everything in between just, it sort of fell off. Again, if this is a 1.5 to 10, it would probably perform significantly better, but I can't know that for sure because I'm not an engineer that's going to design it and develop it and make it. But if I was on that team, I would say, hey, let's give this a go to see how it works. We have the exact same performance dynamically. The greatest thing about it is the illumination being on the second focal plane. The 1.5, you could really push in and out. Even side to side with the 1.5 is good. But as we slowly increase that magnification, you're going to see just how quickly this thing tapers off. It's not like a slow, steady ramp. It's like, oh, that's a cliff. And you're just going to fall right off the edge. It's dramatic. And unless you're using this thing at 1x, 1.5x rather, and like 10x, you're not going to be using the entire magnification range on this thing. I would have loved to have could say that, you know, your $3,000 gets you the best possible optic, but when it performs very clearly, visibly like this, I can't say that it's even worth $2,000 when the other sub $2,000 scopes that we've looked at all perform way better than this. It really makes me appreciate simpler scopes that just work. This thing has every bell and whistle, some way more features on it than it has any need or right to even have. But it doesn't matter if the thing is unusable to get behind and actually use. I did not enjoy my experience behind this thing at all. And I can't imagine that a lot of people would get behind this and go, yeah, this is amazing. If you spend $3,000 on it, sure, I could see you wanting to justify your purchase. But even then, I'm sorry, they just don't impress me optically.
Yep, all that target range time is going to pay off today.
For this last part, before I get into my final thoughts and closing arguments, I wanted to try to bring a little bit more dynamicism, if that's even a word, to my reviews. So a very dear friend of mine was nice enough to send over his Trigger Cam 2.1 so I could mount it to the behind all of these scopes and use them in different environments. The footage that you see right now is at Tommy Gun Warehouse in Greeley, Pennsylvania, home of car products, Tommy Gun, Desert Eagle, and stuff like that. In their backyard, they have a 600-yard range, and I wanted to use all of these optics out at those distances, engaging the steel at every 100 yards, using the reticle and then dialing for elevation, and see how well they fared. First, though, I want to go into my bedroom, in my backyard, at their minimum magnifications, and then work our way up to this to see how it fares here. These are going to be in no particular order, but ironically, we're going to start with the Athlon Helos BTR Gen 2. It's just the first scope that I picked up. So, I have this mounted on my Ruger. I have this in my bedroom. We're looking at my paper target at 81 or so yards. The gun is clear. The gun is not loaded. I'm just doing dry fire practice. And we will see how all of these scopes perform at their maximum magnifications out to 600 yards at Tommy Gun Warehouse after this. But know that with the Athlon at 2x, there's not a single issue I have with the scope. So you are aware, does crop the image considerably. So you're seeing maybe like half the image looking through the thing, I would say. I do a couple little minor tests with all these scopes, but I'm going to just cut to the chase as we slowly start to progress. 2x on this thing, no issues whatsoever. The reticle, no issues whatsoever. Illumination, more than bright enough given the environment. It was a slightly overcast day, late fall, so pretty good lighting conditions. Perfect for mocking a hunt, really, in these sort of backyard woods in the Northeast. If you're wondering where the rest of this footage is or what this video was, it was just a video that I had cobbled together for my Subscribestar and Patreon supporters. This way, they need something for their support and love over the years, and I needed to film anyway, so why not take advantage of it? There was no issues I had with getting behind the scope in these environments, whether it was sitting, kneeling, moving around. I kept it only at the minimum magnification because that's where I want to see how it's going to perform. Next up is the March FX, and boy howdy does that reticle really stand out in these conditions. Even without illumination, it's super easy to pick up and see. Panning across the trees, you're going to see a lot of weird refresh rate stuff going on with the camera that they used inside the trigger cam, but to my eye, there's no real difference. There's a slight loss of brightness and a little loss of sharpness, but not a dramatic amount where I, the shooter looking through the trigger cam, could really feel like it was a giant hindrance. Maybe a little bit in adverse conditions, but here it was no issue. In this instance, with the March at 1.5x at 81 or so yards, I kind of wish every scope in this magnification range had a dual focal plane reticle, but everything would be really, really expensive. As you can see, maximum sharpness on this setup is not ideal. It really takes a long time to fine tune every scope for the camera and vice versa. So it took me a little bit longer than I would have liked, but it is what it is. With running it through the same course of fire, I experienced no real issues with it. Despite the fact it was in a higher mount than I needed with a fairly large cant, getting behind it wasn't that difficult, but it still wasn't as easy as with the Athlon. You could see on the screen in front of you that there are some shadows in the far corners. That's just because of how much smaller the view is through the March versus the Athlon. Let's now look at a IPVO that's a little bit more focused on precision, the Vector Continental 2-12. The reticle already is much harder to use at the center without illumination in this environment. It blends into that tree as if it wasn't even there. The posts at 3, 6, and 9 are clearly visible, but the rest of it really does get very hard to see. Another thing that I noticed, that when I do get on target with this, the little ranging portion at the 12 o'clock position confused me a little bit because I wasn't sure exactly where the center was. With illumination, however, it does get much better, clearly, but this reticle really does struggle in these environments at lower magnification. It's really good in the higher magnifications, but down here, if you wanted to engage something at these sort of distances in this style of area, you just know that you're going to be in for a little bit of a struggle. Happily, however, the Eyebox on this thing was fairly forgiving, and getting behind it was a non-issue. From one precision-ish setup scope to another, the Steiner H6Xi. The STL reticle, just like we saw with the CTR reticle, the posts at 3, 6, and 9 are pretty good, but the center part of that reticle is basically non-existent. You can't see it at all. It's a little bit worse than the CTR reticle, but unfortunately, it doesn't perform as good as the CTR once we start increasing the magnification, in my humble opinion. This was by far the hardest scope to get behind and actually acquire the paper target with. Also with the Eyebox, it seemed a little bit more restrictive than I thought it was going to be. It's just not a very well set up scope for this style of engagements, so please keep that in mind. The SwampFox WarHawk is another example of a scope that has too fine of a reticle for this environment. The posts at 3, 6, and 9 are very clear and easy to see, being so thick, but that center section just disappears completely. Fortunately, at least the Eyebox getting behind this thing is quite enjoyable at 2x. If I was to play around with these scopes at 4 or 5x, right around their midway point, then this scope would really start to suffer. What I'm basically doing is ensuring that my side parallax is set before I go ahead and start filming and dry firing. But with this one, I definitely had a more challenging time with. The biggest thing for me is actually finding the perfect center on this, because you might see where the center of the reticle is, but being behind this thing in an awkward position trying to find an 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper at 81 yards, I kept on confusing the actual horizontal center line for the line just above it. With the illumination on, it definitely helps, but I kept struggling with it. I would break a shot and say, that was a good shot, but then I'd slow down a little bit and realize, oh, I'm not perfectly centered on the paper. And it was Mostly me just not being able to read the reticle properly. That's how fine it gets. So everybody makes mistakes, right? I made a mistake with the Mk4HD. When I threw the trigger cam on there, I forgot to confirm the focus before I started filming. So shame on me. Everything's going to be slightly blurry because the trigger cam has to be set to the scope in question. That is why the reticle is as blurry as it is. But regardless of that fact, it's still easier to pick up than some of the other precision-focused scopes that we've looked at. So take that for what it's worth. Getting behind the Mk4HD is just a breeze. It's a joy. The Eyebox on it's very forgiving. It doesn't have the largest view looking through it. You can see how much of the scope body we could actually see, but it's just a joy. Illumination on it is excellent. The TMR reticle, hate it or love it. If you're looking for one of these scopes that could do precision-ish work and hunting work, I would highly recommend the Mk4HD. Not only for its capacity with its glass, but its reticle and its weight. And its simplicity. You got like 3 things you could adjust, and that's it. Just keep it simple, stupid. And that is why I love this scope. But we're not into my final thoughts yet. Let's look at our final scope and then put it out to 600 yards. The GLx at 2.5x is quite good. Getting behind it's very easy. The image stability is decent, but here in this environment, that center chevron and that large horseshoe are perfect. They're very easy to pick up. They're very easy to see, despite the fact we don't have anything drawing our eye to the center other than the section of the reticle itself. It still works quite well. Illumination, I wish this thing was brighter, especially they were smart enough to only illuminate the chevron. I would have loved to see this thing be just like 2 or 3 times brighter than what it is. Unfortunately, it's not the case, but it would really make this thing respond like a prism. If that was the case, which, I mean, who wouldn't want a prism that was adjustable from 2.5 to 10x, especially in a very lightweight, simple package like this. Overall, getting behind it here was an absolute joy, and I could see why so many people really love these optics. Very easy to pick up the chevron, very easy to get it on center, and no real complaints. Now let's set our sights on something with a little bit more substance. At Tommy Gun Warehouse, they have a 600-yard range in their backyard with steel set up every 100 yards. That made this the perfect location for me within a fairly short drive to test and see how all these scopes function at distance. 600 yards is a very engageable distance. I am shooting my 5.56 Ruger American Ranch, 16-inch barrel, and I started with PMC X-Tac M193 55 grain heads, which I know my gun shoots really well. But the wind and the conditions were so bad that the 55 grain bullets were just going all over the place. Not to mention, some of the plates are rather large downrange because they shoot 50 cals on this range. So the 55 grains didn't have enough oomph to move the plates. So I switched to 77 grain OTMs, and it made a world of difference. At 100 yards, no problems there. That's roughly where all of these optics are zeroed in for. We're going to push it now out to 200 yards, which is basically just a top plate hold on the very small plate there all the way to the right. I was originally going to use the reticle for holding and then dial, but it was very cold that day and my brain stopped working, so I ended up dialing out to 600 and then holding for 5 and 6, whereas the rest of the scopes that we'll look at after this, it was the exact opposite. I would hold out to 600 and then I would dial 400, 500, and 600. Right there is 400 yards. Made a pretty good impact on that large plate. You could just barely hear it. And out to 500 and 600 yards, well, you really can't see that much. The fog was very bad. It was pouring rain and freezing cold. Fortunately, I realized that the front lens on the SwampFox was obscured by a lot of dew, rain falling off onto the table and splashing into the lens. Wiping it off yielded a much better result. But still, the fog was pretty rough. However, using both the turrets and the reticle to dial out the distance on this thing was pretty easy. I would say that the drop Christmas tree section is a little bit confusing with all those little openings and dots. I find myself having to confirm 2 or 3 times exactly where I am before I break a shot. But in these conditions, which were rather horrible, out to 600 yards with the scope was no problem. Same course of fire, but slightly different layout. I'm going to start by using the reticle itself to hold at distance and then dial from 4, 5, and 600 yards. At this point, the fog had definitely started to dissipate. Unfortunately, it dissipated because the wind started to come in, which is not great. It was pushing the rounds pretty far, up to 3/4 of a mil at the worst point, but I also noticed that it was switching back and forth. And because all the wind socks were soaking wet, they weren't really that much of a help. Anyway, I make short work of 100, 200, and 300 yards. Basically just holding no more than 2 mils. At 400 yards, I check the wind flags to see what the wind is doing, and I just hold basically dead center and miss because there's actually wind down there, but the flags weren't moving. So I made an educated guess and held left edge and did a much better job because I actually hit the plate. That's also one of the large, heavy plates, so they don't really move as much as I would need to really call a good shot. You could see that the fog is definitely getting a little bit better downrange, but it's still not ideal conditions. For 500 yards, it's just about 5 mils hold and about 600 yards for 6 mils. So very simple and easy to use all of these scopes with this particular rifle and ammunition combination. Moving out to 600 yards, I hold left edge like I did with the other 2 targets to make a hit, and I clearly missed. So I checked the wind flags again. They are doing the exact same thing as they were, basically doing nothing. So I decided just to hold center, and as you will see, it's a hit. Using this Griffin reticle to hold at distance was a breeze. It was very easy. Very easy to read, pick out where you're supposed to go, and just hold. It's really, really simple. I like how thin the drop is, and I like the size of the dots for all the wind and elevation holds. It's just a really nice layout. Dialing up for elevation, I bring it out to 400 yards. I went under the first target, so I brought it up just a little bit. No issues there. Going out to 500 yards, the chevron really is large, but you can still make out as long as you don't mind shooting pumpkin on a post. If you're the type of person that likes to have a small dot in the center of your target and see the whole target, you're not going to like this reticle. But you could always choose just to hold, and holding up to 6 mils at 600 yards was no problem whatsoever. Again, the trigger cam crops the image quite considerably. We do see well past 10 mils on the hold, so you could effectively use this for much more extended ranges. But it makes short work of 400, 500, and 600 yards. So as if the weather conditions weren't bad enough, I chose to run all of these scopes at their maximum. Unfortunately, I only had about 3 hours to do a lot of filming and a lot of shooting and a lot of setup, so I didn't get the chance to really run these the way that I would have liked at different magnifications and different positions, but maybe the next time I run this test. Anyway, the March FX at 15x at 100 yards. It's way too much magnification for this distance for me shooting this style of setup, but you're going to see it as good as possible. About 1 or so mils high for 200 yards, easy peasy. 300 yards, about 2 mils, 4, 5, and 6. Very simple, very easy to know. It's just how the wind decides it wants to shift. The reticle on the March is quite good, but you can see where the second focal plane reticle, which is the thicker section at 3, 6, and 9, you can see where at the 6 o'clock position it slightly favors the left-hand side of the first focal plane reticle. That's something that you have to note, because you're holding dead center on that, you're actually going to be holding slightly off. Another thing that you have to note is you might not be able to see beyond 5 mils or 6 mils in this case on the elevation drop, but I can when I'm looking through the scope. So I'm able to see what's going on downrange through the scope perfectly fine, but we're going to have a hard time seeing the targets through the camera at 600 yards. I try to adjust the side parallax to make it as good as possible at these distances, but it still just looks really, really cruddy. Even to the naked eye, it was about as good as what you could see here. Conditions definitely lightened up. We lost a lot of the fog, thankfully, but the rain had stayed with us, and if anything, it only got worse. So Two did the temperature. It started dropping into the high 30s. In fact, it started snowing when I was on my way out of here. So it was a brutal day. But using the reticle for holding was quite easy. It's just the stadia line in the middle gets a little bit on the thicker side. I prefer it if it stayed thinner for longer. But that's how they bring the fiber optic tube up for the illumination on this particular scope, I reckon. What I decided to do was now give myself the benefit of the doubt and decrease the magnification to an indicated 10x to see if it would improve optical performance and visibility downrange. And it does, but it's still not what I consider to be, oh wow, that's super sharp and clear. I just don't know what it is with these March scopes, but I've said my beliefs more than once. I've made myself quite vocal on that. And maybe it's just me, maybe it's bad luck with Marches that I have, but I'm just not super duper impressed with them optically. We backtrack to the 400-yard target and I dial for elevation. Unfortunately, the trigger cam rotated, so that's why you see the black bars on the top and the bottom. Very short work with the wind not blowing too hard, increasing the elevation by about a mil for 500 yards. I hold for the larger IPSC targets because that's a little bit more realistic target for this style of shooting, especially considering I was running a very rough zero. I had literally threw ammunition in the gun, threw the SwampFox on top because I know it tracks perfectly. And I was like, all right, let's see what happens. And it took me about a half hour to make sure that everything was more than good enough. And that's what I ran. So could this have been better? Yeah, absolutely. I might have missed a lot less, but ultimately I was able to get the results that I was looking for and collect the data that I wanted. When it comes to the Athlon, I like showing off how effective and capable it is at the minimum magnification. I think I've done that for the last, holy shiznits, 2 hours and 30 minutes. 2x 100 yards, easy peasy, lemon squeezy. Super easy, in fact. At 200 yards, I try to do the same thing, but I miss because I didn't properly confirm my windage. I'm a poopy head. So I do have a couple targets that I miss, and I slowly learn that as I progress down. You could very clearly see the splash to the bottom left of the target, and I made the adjustment, and I try again. But I didn't do it enough. I was still just under it, so yeah, shame on me. As far as the reticle found here in the Athlon, it might appear to a lot of people to be really thick, but here at 12x, it's really not that thick. The center dot is a little bit on the larger side, but again, being a 1 MOA dot, here at 300 yards, that's a 3-inch circle. That is not that bad. Again, my windage was off. I dropped that round to the left. So I correct by holding more or less on the center, thinking that the wind is still pushing from left to right, and I made a hit. So, foolish me. This is why you should confirm your setups before you put yourself out there for the world to see. Making a very minor adjustment, I engaged the 400-yard steel, and I finally made what I consider to be a good contact hit. That plate is a little bit thinner than the large plate to the right, so I started engaging that for a few times just to actually see what was going on. I still go for the silhouette at 500 yards, but I just miss. Again, the wind was playing a lot of havoc. Plus, with a bad windage, it's not ideal. Holding right edge makes a good solid hit. And out to 600 yards, we're going to hold on the 6 line, and we're going to hold on the right edge again. Breaking the shot just over the shoulder, and that was a good hit. This reticle is so easy and fast and efficient and just simple at these distances. For good luck, I shot the small gong to the right, and without even worrying about it, I made a hit. For anyone that complains that this reticle is not capable enough of accuracy, I don't know what your definition of accuracy is. Maybe it's shooting dime-sized holes at 300 yards. But for anyone else that's into practical style shooting, I don't know if you can get much better than this. In fact, I'm going to showcase that right now.
At 200 yards, let's see if we can hit 400, which is only 3 mils. 1, 2, 3. That's the nice thing about this reticle. You could use it even at minimum magnification out to 400 yards effectively. And
I really do love this thing. The Athlon Helos BTR Gen 2 is just a wonderful combination of just about everything. With the elevation dialed up on the excellent turrets, I hold just right edge to make a good solid hit due to the wind, and I continue cranking that up for 500 and 600 yards. The 77 grain OTMs are very good, consistent ammunition to this gun, well under an inch every single time that I've tried to group them. And I haven't chronoed them, but it doesn't matter. I'm not shooting for 1,000 yards with 77 grains. You could just see the round go over the top of that plate. So I hold a little low, and I make a good solid hit. Yes, I was able to spot that shot.
Wow.
What more could you ask for?
The more I shoot with the scope, the more I love it.
Moving on to the H6Xi and the STL. At 100 yards, well, that's not going to be challenging. At 200 yards, it's not going to be challenging. We'll get to the more challenging bits, but just look at the reticle and see how much harder it is to decipher what is what on this thing, as opposed to the AMHR2 we just looked at and had very successful engagement out to distance at both styles of shooting, whether it be minimum or maximum magnification. I understand where they were trying to go with this, but again, I'll drive it home one last time. It's not designed for this magnification range.
I feel underperformed. 3 mils, a little hard. See, the thing is with this reticle, while I have it here and I'm holding for it, the numbers on the side are really small and they get confused to me. I get confused rather with the crosses. So in between 2, 4, and 6, you got the cross on the outside. I can't differentiate that between the numbers easily or fast enough. So it takes me a little while to like, okay, wait, I gotta count and confirm. So 3 mils at 400, 1, 2, 3, hold right-ish. Good solid hit. 5 at 5.
It's the little nuanced stuff that I notice, and that's the stuff that I basically bitch and moan about, because it's stuff that it just doesn't make that much sense to me. They could have just made the numbers a little bit larger. They could have made the crosses just a little bit bigger. They could have eradicated the crosses at the far end and just numbered each individual line. But they didn't, and I would love to know why. Is that so much to ask for?
The elevation turret on this is also 12 mils per rotation, and it makes a quick turn of the turret a little bit challenging at times, because if you're in between 1/10 of a mil, it's going to be a little bit tricky. Good solid hit, and then 6-ish. Yeah, like the stadia lines, you seem a little bit tight, and the way the turret locks on the erector, it could really favor a line. It's a little tricky. It's something you really have to pay attention to. 6, 4, 6, small gong, right. Good, solid hit.
I'm definitely sounding like I'm ripping the scope apart. I just feel it's a cobbled together optic, and it wasn't as thought out as it really should have been. Steiner, let Vector Optics show you how you should put together a scope. This reticle is arguably much cleaner, much easier to read, and much nicer in many different ways. Using this thing for precision work is exactly what it was intended for, and it fits this magnification range almost flawlessly. I say almost flawlessly because I would still like a little bit more usability at the lower magnification. But at the higher magnification and at distance, boy howdy is it enjoyable to use. I really couldn't fault this thing for any way, shape, or form. The shot glass out here looks quite good, but talking strictly on the reticles and holding, it's very, very nice. It's very fine, but yet still very easy to pick up and read. It's what I wish that the Steiner had. If the Steiner had a reticle more like this, I would absolutely like it more, but maybe someone else won't. And it's not all about what I want. It might sound like that. I just complain about the things that I don't particularly care for and try to just make better things. You could see the round that impacted in the berm to the right of the target. I'm able to spot that really quickly, chamber another round, and hold for a very fast follow-up shot and make a very good hit. This scope outperforms its price point considerably. Using the quite excellent turrets that are on it as well proves that when you dial up and you actually have a fairly decent dope, you can make pretty good hits. For anyone complaining that the AMHR2 has too large of a dot, this CTR has the perfect size dot for this style of work. You want to shoot at 4-inch plates at 500 yards, this is the reticle that I would probably use. Unfortunately, I still can't spot my splash at 500 yards. Every time I've gone here, it's always harder and harder to see. It's just the way that the dirt is laid out. I could just make out some hits, or some misses rather, and I was able to realize I had to drop it a little bit low and a little bit left. Again, the wind flags were doing absolutely nothing. But 6 mils for 600 yards on a, I believe it's a C-zone IPSC target, but I could be wrong. I hold the wrong side because I'm just retarded. What do you want from me? And I break the shot on an empty chamber. But with a fast magazine change and proper dope hold, I make a good solid hit.
Bang, bang, bang. Awesome reticle at 12x. Awesome reticle out to 600 yards, both holding and dialing. Excellent glass. I can spot my shot at 600 yards with relative ease. Yeah, pretty good. I haven't turned any of the illuminations on today, but it's because I haven't needed the illuminations. I'm shooting this exactly as I would. I would honestly not run any of these at their maximum magnification for most of these shots, but to give you an idea of what this thing looks like at 2x, I'm still dialed up 6 mils. That's a little bit of a tricky shot. I won't even be able to spot it. Let's go back to 400 yards. I felt that was a good in between. Back to 0, 3. Just left edge, that small plate right there. Yeah, it looked like a hit. I saw a big splash. Yep. Good enough for me.
Stuff like that really does make my heart smile. I'm going to flat out say it. I think the TMR is the most controversial reticle of the entire bunch, and I completely understand. However, when using it in this sort of engagement zone and area, you will see that despite its issues, and despite my problems with it, and its age and all that, it can still be used quite effectively. I technically made the hit at 100 yards. It was just a touch low, and it did rock the plate. So I counted that a good hit. And a good solid hit for 200 yards on the small plate. Out to 300 yards, this is basically cakewalk at this point, but I still missed the shot because the bullet decided it wanted to fly a little high. Because I never properly confirmed my 0. So don't be a fool like me and do exactly what I just did, which was just be lazy. However, as we slowly start to increase our distance, you're going to note that the glass clarity on this scope seems vastly superior to everything else that we've looked at. I can't explain it either. It was still pouring rain. The fog was gone basically like halfway through the shooting day. But this scope just seems to work extremely good in these conditions. Better than it, I feel, has any right to. I went just over the head on that one, but 500 yards for me has always been my Achilles heel at this range. I just can't describe it. I'm just broken, I guess. It's the only thing that makes sense. I must be broken. But I give it a good old college try because I have to make a good solid hit like I do right there before I engage 600 yards. Holding with the TMR is not my favorite thing because, as you can see, those stadia lines don't have any numbers next to them until you get to the 10 mil mark. Instead, you will see that the first 5 mils, whether it's on the windage or the elevation holds, is a little bit thinner than the line at the 5 mil mark. So that is how you indicate where your 5 mil is. However, looking at that really quickly, trying to figure that out is quite challenging. And I would just love to see numbers every 2, 4, 6, 8, 10 mils, just like the mil gap that we looked at the USO a little bit over 2 hours ago. Dialing with the Mk4HD is quite nice, but not as nice as the Mk5, primarily because the lowest series of numbers on the full mil mark literally sits on the very bottom of the turret. However, when you do finally get your dope and you use the center for a hold, it's actually really nice. That center dot is very, very fine, and the gap around it allows you to put the target inside that gap and make a hit like that. And it's super fast and easy. It's quite great. But if you had to hold for wind, you have those very large lines that are going to obscure some of your target. However, if you have a good dope, 1, 2, 3, as fast as you could squeeze the trigger. My biggest issue with the Mk4 is the turrets where the numbers are touching the bottom, so you really can't see exactly where your full mil mark is. The Mk5HD has a little line underneath the numbers, and that's all they needed to do. But with the Mk4s, they gave you 3 rows of numbers, not just 2, because I guess they assume that you're going to dial up to 30 plus mils on this thing, and it just makes no sense to me. Just for the hell of it, I decided to engage the 600-yard target again, because why not? And with great ease, I managed to do it. I dial it back to 0 and engage it again, and I did just nick the edge of it. Again, the nice thing with the Mk4 or the Mk5 or even the GLX is dialing with these turrets and resetting them back to 0 and having them lock at 0. It's super fast, very easy, and very reassuring. But I think that's all for this series, folks. At the 2 hour, 44 minute, and 44 second mark right now, I think it's time to try to get into my final thoughts and figure out how I'm going to wrap this video.
It's time to choose.
What better time to wrap up this video series than on Thanksgiving morning when it's pouring rain outside and quite chilly. Very happy Thanksgiving to all of you. This has been a very long video, and I'm not going to apologize for that. I had a lot of information that I wanted to convey to all of you about not only how these 7 scopes operate, but all of the other IPVOs that I'm dubbing them, how all of those have operated in the past. There are a lot of other scopes on the market, a lot of which I haven't talked about, a lot of which I tried to mention, but there are some from obscure manufacturers that I really don't have a whole lot of information on. I tried to roll that up into this video as much as possible, but I really wanted to focus on all of the ones that I actually have hands-on experience with, because I feel, me having the amount of scopes under my belt that I currently do, I'd be able to extract most of the useful information out of all of them. How I have these divvied up on the table before you is speed versus precision. Now, I don't mean that in any sort of way as far as how they track or all of their controls. I mean on the general overall setup of all of these optics. The Leupold Mk4HD with its illuminated TMR is one of the fastest to get behind. It's a 2.5 to 10x, and that 4x multiplier really does mean that you have a very generous and forgiving eyebox. The fact it doesn't have a side parallax means that you don't ever have to adjust it. And Leupold did some sort of magic with it where it actually works. And the overall package is definitely set up more or less for using it fast. And in my findings, my personal uses with it, it's been exactly that. It's second only to the Athlon as far as how much time I have behind all of these scopes individually. And the Athlon really starts to split that difference a little bit, where the Reticle on it is definitely very capable of speed, but also very good for more precision work, as are all the controls and how it tracks. The Primary Arms GLx, it sort of fits that role where it can do a little bit of both, but just note that the drops on the Christmas tree reticle are much better for holding than I think this scope is set up for dialing, primarily because that very large chevron, it's not going to be everyone's cup of tea. But also being a 2.5 to 10 means that you have a very forgiving eyebox, and that center chevron being large means it's very easy to pick up and put on target very quickly. It might not just be the most accurate for a lot of people. On this end of the spectrum, we have the Steiner H6Xi 2 to 12. Build quality on it is very good. The materials are very, very nice. A lot of the controls and touch points are good, but the fact it doesn't have a lock-in elevation turret is a little bit unnerving. For a lot of people, it's not going to make a difference. And that's the thing you have to consider. A lot of these things are going to be problematic for you, and some other things aren't. But for someone else out there, it might be a deal breaker. 12 mils per rotation, I think, is a little bit too fine for the elevation turret on that scope. And I wish they just threw a lock like they have on the T6Xis. I think that would be a game changer for that, and it would solve most of that scope's problems. Optically, it's fantastic, and the reticle is great above like 10x, but below that, I think it's really too fine for this intermediate powered variable optic segment. It sort of falls just a little bit short. Ideally, I would personally run that scope capped if I had it with a good battle zero and figure out my dope for extended ranges, and that would be a hold-only optic basically for me. Next up is the SwampFox WarHawk. This thing has insanely good glass for what it is. Very forgiving eyebox, good controls, but you could tell it's definitely made to a much lower price point. Optically though, and tracking-wise, this thing is superb, and the Recce reticle is definitely much more focused towards the precision aspect of things, and that's why it's there. If this had the same reticle as the Athlon, wow, that would be a game changer, I think. The all-new, brand-new Vector Continental 2-12 is frankly great. The reticle on it is kind of like the DMX reticle found in most NightForce LPVOs. And I've been saying ever since I got my hands on the NX8 and the Attacker 1-8s with the DMX reticle, that would be the perfect reticle for an IPVO like these. And Vector went ahead and basically borrowed a lot of the DNA from that reticle and threw it in the scope. And it works extremely well. It definitely is more towards the middle, whereas it can do both aspects really, really well. And it's something I really do appreciate. I also really appreciate the build quality of this. It feels like a more premium scope, but it costs much more on the lower budget end of things. It's very, very impressive. And last but not least for this ensemble is the March FX 1.5-15. How could it not be? With a dual focal plane reticle in a 1.5 to 15x magnification range, and some of the best feeling elevation and windage turrets on the market, bar none, with a very simple and elegant locking system for both, how could it not be the best all-rounder here? But it's $3,000. And optically, I still think that it struggles above 12x, but from 1.5 to 10, it's really competent. The in-between magnifications of around 2 to 5x starts to show a little bit of image instability, which I'm not the biggest fan of. And I guarantee you most of that is just because this is a 10x multiplier. Everything else is either a 4x, a 5x, or a 6x. This is a 10x. Now, I have looked at some 8x's in the past. I believe we're going to be talking about the IOR Valdata 2-16. That was just overall a train wreck, but to each their own. Maybe the one I had was just seriously flawed. But with the March FX 1.5-15, I think this is a much more cohesive package than the Shorty 1-10. Some people are going to hate me for saying that, but I feel it's true. The front objective definitely aids to the overall ability of this scope to outperform the Shorty, as does the overall just size and weight. When you have more room to grow, sometimes things grow better, like plants. You put them in a small planter, don't expect a giant oak tree to grow out of a 6-inch pot. But that's it. This is great. It's definitely the most versatile as far as its ability to be used at 1.5x very fast and efficiently. But even at 15x, the reticle really does blossom into this beautiful milling reticle. Unfortunately, optically, I think, and as you've seen, I've tried to show it as much as possible, I feel above 15x, or at 15x above 12x, it falls apart a little bit, which is very unfortunate. But I don't think that's going to stop a lot of people from buying this, and I think that they will be more or less overall satisfied with it. I know the owner of this scope clearly is. I mean, his paint job on it is a little bit unique, and I wouldn't think he ever plans on selling it as a result. The final takeaway from these 7 scopes, no, that's not a boys reference, it's just I had 7 scopes to get my hands on and play with for the last 3 or 4 months. But the final takeaway is, I really do think that there's something here for everybody. Whether it's these 7 or all the scopes that we've talked about, it's amazing to see this many options available in the IPVO segment. You have scopes that cost low 300s to 3,000 and almost everything in between. There's a flavor for almost everybody. There's a price point for almost everybody, and there are options for almost everybody. Do I still think that there could be improvements made? Absolutely. Would I still like to see some companies produce an IPVO like this? Absolutely. SWI and or Primary Arms and or most other manufacturers out there. Wake up. But you can't have everything. But thankfully, what we do have is all pretty friggin' good. If I had to pick out a standout among all of these, it's really, really hard because a lot of them bring something individual to the table, like I've already mentioned. But every time I get behind the Mk4HD, I'm floored with how good it is, how small it is, how light it is, how simple it is, but yet how efficient and effective it is at operating as good as it does. Not having a parallax knob on that is actually a blessing because it's one less thing you have to worry about. And even though I'm not the biggest fan of push-button illumination, it's so simple and lightweight and elegant that you wouldn't really think that scope would be as good as it is, but it is. Not saying that everything else here sucks, but as an overall package for me, it's the one that I tend to gravitate towards the most, even though the TMR reticle is not my favorite of the bunch. I would still probably give it to the Athlon Helos BTR Gen 2 for an overall package, especially for the price. It really does impress me every single time I get behind it. And taking it out to 600 yards was an absolute pleasure and joy. But if you don't like what those scopes offer, guess what? There's plenty of other options available, thankfully. And that is what I'm thankful for on this very chilly, rainy Thanksgiving morning. And I'm also thankful for all of you for staying tuned and watching this video and listening to me talk about this for God knows how many hours, because I haven't started the editing process yet, but I know it's going to be a very long video. I don't know how I'm going to do it, especially I don't know how I'm going to do it before Christmas. That's my plan. That's my goal. So here's hoping that it'll be done within 3 days, but I'm not going to hold my breath on that one. But thank you all seriously very much for watching and staying tuned. And thank you all so much for lending these scopes in. Most of these scopes have been lent in either by individual viewers or by companies. Vector sent this in. SwampFox did not. That was from one of my friends. I purchased the Athlon and I purchased the Leupold Mk4HD. That doesn't mean that I have any sort of particular bias towards them. I just think that they're very good packages. But I would honestly have no problem owning any of these if I could afford most of them. But with all that being said, I got to end this video sometime. So what better way to do it than on a thank you? I'll see you again next time.
And a huge thank you to my Patreon providers and my Subscribe subscribers. Without you, this truly wouldn't be possible. If you'd like to support my channel but don't want to join either of those, I completely understand. But you could still help by using my affiliate links in the description below and or like, share, and subscribe as always. Again, thank you very much.